We're live apparently. So we are. So YouTube and Facebook can hear us now, Jordan, and see what's on screen.
All right.
Hello, YouTube and Facebook. We were just waiting for some people to come in the stream, and then I'm sure Jordan will do a proper introduction for this live stream in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So YouTube and Facebook, we're doing something a little bit different today. We're actually going to be streaming an X Space because the X Space is a great avenue for interaction and for allowing people to ask questions in a way that's moderated. You can absolutely still ask questions in the comments in YouTube and Facebook here, and I can bring them up on the screen and address them. The people in the space won't be able to see your comments that I bring up on the screen, but they'll be able to hear me talk to them, and I can basically bring you guys together. So essentially, we're allowing the X Space to be viewed and interacted with through Facebook and through YouTube as well. So I hope you enjoy it. Please, any comments or feedback or anything like that that you'd like to leave, you're welcome to do so. And I'm looking forward to a good night tonight. Good evening, people of X. There's not too many people in the X space just yet. We're kicking off a little bit early. Preston, my co-host, will be joining me from the Libertarian Australia page. There's a couple of people he personally has blocked that might want to be able to listen to this. So basically, the Libertarians Oz page, unless you're also blocked from that, in which case, congratulations, the trolls have been fed. We're looking forward to having a really good conversation tonight and to really unpacking the policy platform that the Libertarian Party has announced today. I'm Jordan Ditloff. I'm your host. I'm the lead Senate candidate for the Libertarian Party in Victoria. I'm sorry, just about to bring up the Libertarian Party Oz as a co-host. Bear with me one moment, guys. Now, for those of you who are tuning in on our X Space, tonight we're doing a bit of an interesting hybrid. Tonight we're actually doing a combination. So we're streaming the X Space as we often do, but this time with a difference. We're actually streaming this space live onto YouTube and Facebook with StreamYard. So that might sound a bit complicated. What it means, you don't have to change anything you do as an X Space participant. You guys basically still engage with the space and with the hosts and put your hand up to speak and so on as you normally would. But in addition to this space and the people in it interacting, we've also got people watching from YouTube and Facebook, and they can basically hear and see your comments and questions, and they can basically participate in the space without being on X themselves. So we're basically using StreamYard to boost the space into YouTube and Facebook to have a couple of additional mediums. If people on Facebook and YouTube participate in the comments, I can see those comments and I might read them out and engage with them for the benefit of you guys in the space. So if I do that, I'll be basically stating what the question from YouTube or Facebook was and then addressing it so that everyone can hear and can participate in that. So Preston, are you there? You're live from the Libertarian Party HQ?
Yes, Jordan, I'm here. And first of all, let me say Happy Australia Day to, of course, yourself. Happy Australia Day to all of our listeners, especially those on other platforms. I believe you said YouTube and Facebook who are listening in tonight.
Mate, I'm like Will Ferrell in Elf on Christmas at the moment. I'm Australia Day'd out. I'm so exhausted. I've been going since about 8 o'clock. I've done 3 Australia Day events all across the state. I was in Anglesea at 8 a.m. for breakfast with the Lions Club of Anglesea. I was in Torquay for lunch with the Libertarian Party. And then I was in St Kilda East at the gardens there for the Australia Day rally that I also spoke at, and then drove home from Melbourne. So I've had another big weekend and clocked some city miles. But nevertheless, still ready to come back for round 5 and go through this policy document with you guys. So I know that our policies and policy platform, and in particular policy areas like immigration, have been a source of frequent questions and anticipation. Some of that anticipation, is going to be met with disappointment by some. Some people will not be happy with everything that's in this document. Some people will think some things don't go far enough. Others will think that some things are in there that shouldn't be. That's the nature of politics. That's the nature of human beings. But unlike other parties where they'll just basically try to hoodwink and throw everything against the wall and hope people don't notice or hope people don't engage, we are being upfront and I'm making myself available on my Sunday evening of the long weekend, and the party is providing our policy platform upfront in full. You know, a lot of other parties drip feed. They want to do announcements. They don't want to basically put their cards on the table. And we're not about that. We're about telling you who we are and what we do on the packet and what you get if you're voting for us. So, you know, as has been the case since the very first X Space I ever did with you guys, the beauty of X Spaces is you can have your say, you can ask questions, you can put your view, and we can have a really good, robust discussion. And in some areas, it might be that I can explain things in a way that you might not have considered, or I can persuade you of a particular policy, or vice versa. You might be able to put your position and we might have to agree to disagree. But in any event, I'm really looking forward to tonight. I'm as relieved as anyone that our policy platform has now dropped. By way of a bit of historical example, the election in 2022, at this point, you know, for probably about 4 months out from the federal election in 2022, we absolutely did not have anywhere near the level of organisation. We had 0 candidates endorsed. We had 0 formal policy platform or policy document released. You know, we weren't running events. We weren't doing any of the things we're doing now. We're so much better organised and we're so much better prepared than we were the last federal election. So I'm really excited, and, you know, agree, disagree, or otherwise, it's an exciting opportunity to go forward with the policies in place and to start campaigning in earnest. So I start full-time campaigning next week on the 31st of January. I'm going to be going over to Perth for that weekend, but once my plane touches back down in Victoria, it's going to be all action stations. And if you're kind of struggling to imagine what a more full-on campaign would look like compared to the campaign we've been running, well, I don't really know what it's going to look like either. I'm a bit scared, but I'm excited.
Jordan, maybe I think we should get straight into it. And of course, anybody listening in on Twitter specifically, if you have questions, I would encourage you to ask questions. Later on, we'll be accepting some more people up to speak, but post your questions or comment your questions on the pinned post on the Nest under the Libertarian Party. Now, Jordan, how I would describe the release of this policy is 3 subjects, 9 topics, and 45 statements. Is that a fair assessment? And was there any thought put into maybe the size, the topics that should be covered, and the length of the policy as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as anyone could imagine, at an election, you've got a really limited bandwidth to talk about things. You can't talk about everything. There's policies the party has. And as I'm about to say this, Robert in the YouTube chat has just asked, what is our take on firearms reform? So asking about firearms policy, you'll notice that's an example of a policy area which is not in that kind of platform or focus for that policy document that we've released. It doesn't mean we don't have policies, and it doesn't mean we can't talk about it tonight. It's just we've basically chosen to focus on those themes as you identified. So the idea of prosperity, economic thriving, getting government out of the way, easing the cost of living on Australians. The idea of family, you know, so basically what policies can we put in place to strengthen communities, to allow individuals to make choices that are right for their family, and freedom. So we've got freedom of speech, we've got foreign affairs, we've got a number of other issues and segments within this policy document. And we've really tried to hone in on the things I think that make our party different. You know, there are a lot of areas where we share positions in common, or at least common concerns, with some other minor parties in the centre and right of politics. But libertarians do have some really creative solutions to some of those problems, applying our principles to those questions. And I think the policy document does a really good job of taking what is really complicated stuff. You know, it's basically very difficult to talk about these things in a simplistic way. But I'm really excited with how it looks. I think it's made it really accessible, and I hope that it's been easy to read for those of you who have had a look at it. Out of interest, I don't know if we can do a poll at all. I've actually not tried to do a poll with you in our spaces previously, but I'd love to get a sense of how many people have had a chance to read the document so far. That doesn't have to be a poll we wait for the answers to, but I'd be really interested to see so far since the release at 5 o'clock how many people have had an opportunity to read it.
Of course, and maybe we can get a very quick indication from people. Send a thumbs up emoji if you have read it. And of course, Jordan will start to see them pop up on the screen shortly. So, prosperity, family, and freedom are the three subjects that the policy speaks on. Of course, under prosperity, there is economy, money, and energy. Under family, education, women and children, and immigration. And under freedom, free speech, privacy, and foreign affairs. Now, Jordan, I'd love to give you just an opportunity to touch on each of these three subjects a bit deeper. And then I think we'll zoom in a little bit to the 45 statements and go through those one by one, just briefly, of course, to get through all of them and explain what they mean in layman's terms and how they might affect the everyday Australian.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the economy, that's an obvious one, and it's not first by coincidence. We know heading into 2025 that people are hurting. The economy is not doing well, no matter how the government tries to tell us otherwise. We know that even by the very, very defective standards they measure whether or not we're in a recession, we're almost in a recession. The growth of the economy in the last quarter was tiny. It was about 0.2%. And we're getting figures now from the Australian Financial Review that are telling us that that 0.2% of economic growth, supposedly, that happened in the last quarter was pretty much two-thirds government jobs. I think it was 82%, so a bit more than that. So 82% of all new jobs created in the last quarter were in some way government related jobs, either directly for the APS or consulting or for government-sourced employment like the NDIS and others. So we know that if it weren't for government job creation, which I would argue is often essentially fictional, it's not really adding productive work to the economy. It's just redistributing money around, moving money through from one bucket to the other. So if we took that out, we would have been in a recession for the last 7 quarters now. And you can feel that in the economy, in society, out on the streets and the hustings when I'm campaigning, people are really struggling. You know, I had a situation last weekend where I was at a petrol station waiting to pay for some diesel that I'd put in the Liberty van. And one woman basically, she went through 4 different cards to pay for her petrol. Like she paid some off the amount for her petrol with 4 different cards. And I didn't want to draw attention to her or, you know, shame her or anything for that. But it really made me think, like, far out, things are not good. So, you know, in summary, when it comes to the economy, we say that you should benefit from the sweat of your brow. Like, you should be getting the rewards of your hard work. There should be a reason to work hard. You should be able to advance yourself and your family, and you should be able to make choices about what is the right services for you, what you want to spend your money on. You shouldn't have government coming into your life and into your business and really suffocating and strangling free enterprise with regulation, red tape, green tape, and overzealous regulations. And we also believe the government should be getting out of areas where it is involved in and it doesn't need to be. The ABC is a terrific example that comes front of mind, the ABC, SBS, and other associated services. Like, there's no reason whatsoever that there is a deficiency in the market when it comes to public broadcasting, broadcasting of any kind. It's not a market that needs government involvement. So we basically believe that the free market, that self-interest and mutually beneficial exchange should be the watchwords for the way the Australian economy is structured. And those themes and principles really flow through each of those sort of policy points, I suppose, within the economy section. When it comes to money. We talk a bit in that section about the things that are wrong with the way our fiat currency system is structured at the moment, reserve fractional banking. And we want harder money. That means we want money that's more linked to the true value of money, that can't be eroded by quantitative easing, which is when the government prints money and basically inflates the monetary supply and devalues it. So that's our money policy. We talk about a couple of different themes and principles in there. We do have a separate Bitcoin policy, and I want to make this clear to anyone who's either watching on YouTube or who's in the space listening to this live or who is listening to the space on record. Bitcoiners have been part of a really extensive consultation process that the party's undertaken. That's informed a discussion paper, which a lot of people in the Bitcoin community have either seen, read, or seen circulated. And that hard work is now going into a separate dedicated Bitcoin policy that will be launched and announced on the 8th of March at the Bitcoin Alive conference in Sydney. So I'll be attending that along with Tyler Green, who's one of our Bitcoin experts within the party, John Ruddick, and the three of us will be attending that conference and presenting in a panel. So we're really excited to be sharing the results of that community consultation and policy discussion paper with that community, but we want to keep it a surprise. So we've got some themes in this money section of the policy platform that are echoed and inform our Bitcoin policy, but this is just a little bit of a sneak peek. And I believe we will have a little sort of teaser page up on the website when it comes to Bitcoin and some of the principles that have guided our policy that Bitcoiners can look at in between now and the 8th of March. So education is the next section. Sorry, my apologies. Energy is the next section. And energy is one we have talked about quite a bit, and it's obviously front and center of the policy debate at the 2025 election. We're faced with two legacy parties who basically have competing ideas about what the government should be subsidising. Peter Dutton thinks the government should be subsidising nuclear energy. Anthony Albanese thinks the government should be subsidising wind and solar. Libertarians believe that the government should be getting out of the business of picking winners and losers when it comes to the energy market. And the fact that both of them have been doing this for decades means we have a energy market, the National Energy Market, AEMO, that is completely unfit for purpose. It's resulted in rolling blackouts, load shedding, as if we're, a country like Venezuela. We've got incredible natural advantages. We've got resource abundance, and yet we're paying incredibly high prices for energy, and we're experiencing energy scarcity. It's insane, and there's no reason at all that a country like Australia should be anything other than an energy powerhouse. We should be absolutely in the business of very profitable energy export, but we should also have a populace who have access to abundant, cheap energy of a whole range of types, without that choice or that mix being infected by ideology. So we want to get the ideology out of climate policy, and we don't want to replace it with our preferred type of policy. We don't think that subsidies for renewables like solar and wind should be replaced with subsidies for coal or nuclear. We think that would simply repeat the cycle and the pattern and the end results in a different mix and setting. So we believe that without bans, so allowing nuclear energy to be on the table, and without subsidies, with the government picking winners and losers, the energy market will provide the right mix for Australians, and that will include most likely a mix of baseload like coal and nuclear energy, a mix of hydro, wind and solar, where people choose to do that on private property. But we won't have an energy mix that's dictated by a command and control government economy, basically. So we also advocate for the abolition of renewable energy targets, and this policy point taken in conjunction with our foreign policy point on basically not signing Australia up to multilateral foreign treaties that constrain our policy options really supports our position that we would be withdrawing from the Paris Accords. Unlike Peter Dutton, we have no hesitation saying that that's our position. The fourth section is education. And when it comes to education, we believe that the federal government should really have virtually no role in education. Education is a policy area that belongs with the states who provide the service. And over time, the federal government has just basically wormed its way into a policy area that it shouldn't be involved in at all. And we see a federal Department of Education that employs no teachers, that runs no schools, and simply exists to sluice money around at great cost, because you've got this whole department of government bureaucrats who are all by definition not frontline services. And it's just completely wasteful and completely unneeded. So, many of you are very familiar and happy with the work that Javier Milei is doing in Argentina. And if you're asking us what would we afuera, what would we abolish, departments like the Federal Department of Education, and returning to the real federalism we should have, that our constitution was designed for, and empowering states to run those services and compete with each other to provide the best results. Because at the moment, we've got a national curriculum that is failing objectively. We know that it's failing because Australian students are falling behind in every metric imaginable: maths, science, reading and writing. We have a system now that has failed, and both the Liberal and Labor Party think that the only solution to that is to throw more money at it. And that hasn't worked so far. It's not going to work in future. And all we're going to be doing is throwing good money after bad, when we could return education responsibility to the states. And we could be seeing competitive federalism at work, where state-based curricula could be refined, improved, and compete with one another to see which state can provide the best results and outcomes. We also think there should be real change when it comes to university funding. We'll go into the points by points later, but university should be paid for by the people who gain the benefit of that. That is, the people getting the degree. If the people getting the degree don't get a benefit in terms of a real world work benefit from the degree, it shouldn't be subsidised by the Australian taxpayer. We also support the rights of parents to control the funding that their children are entitled to through the system. So at the moment, the funding per child that does exist goes directly to the school, or it goes directly to the state education department. We say that it should go directly to the parents of the child as a voucher that can then be spent in a competitive way with schools that will arise to service the needs of those parents. And again, that's harnessing that power of competition to improve education outcomes for children. So the fifth policy area we've got is entitled Women and Children. And basically, this is kind of our umbrella heading for gender-related policy, for women's biological rights and rights to women's-only spaces, and some of the policy dimensions of transgender medicine and the way that transgender issues are dealt with in schools at the moment, which is really flying in the face of the findings of the Cass Review and others in the UK. Apparently the science is different here in Australia. Australia refuses to acknowledge a lot of those findings. And we have a lot to say in those areas. So the sixth policy space is immigration. Now, this is one that I know people had really been eagerly awaiting, and it's the one I'm most excited to speak about tonight, because obviously in a very small dot point format document, you don't necessarily get to really unpack exactly what something looks like in practice. And this is an area where at this election, the Australian electorate, the voters, many of you in this space, really want to know, not just generally, handsome monkey king, mate, we're going through at the moment at a high level, we're going through the different areas of the policy, and we'll be going through our policy points directly after this. We're going to be going line by line, so you'll get clear answers on individual points in the policy. You need to be patient and hang out as we go into this deep dive in the policy document and unpack it. You can also have a look at the policy document yourself. If you don't want to wait for that, if you want to open the policy document, go to that section and read what our policy is on that topic. For those who are in the space, there's a question on the YouTube comments from user Handsome Monkey King, where he's asking, speak directly, where do you stand with trans in schools? That will come through the course of tonight. We're going to be going into each area of policy and each of the policy points in more detail. If you don't want to wait for that, you can and should go to our website, bring up the policy document, and you can skip ahead and look at what our points say on that issue. So we've released it, it's there. We're going through in an orderly way each area of the policy, first at a high level and then going through in more detail. So that's what we're doing tonight. If you'd like to hang around and wait for that, you can. Otherwise, you can skip ahead yourself and have a look at the document. So when it comes to immigration, the fundamental principles that the Libertarian Party are taking to this election is the idea that we believe in private property rights and we believe in the right of individuals to exclude unwanted guests. The answer to who owns public infrastructure in Australia, who owns public property, who owns public goods, is not nobody. It's not the state. It's all of us, because we've all paid tax dollars. We've all basically contributed to this infrastructure, and we all have a sense of property and a sense of ownership in national infrastructure. So accordingly, libertarians don't automatically believe in open borders. And we've often had people who are criticizing our party or detracting from our party say that we have an open borders policy. The Libertarian Party in Australia, and previously when we were the Liberal Democrats, have never had an open borders policy. And it's completely consistent with libertarian philosophy to have restrictions on immigration as long as there is publicly owned property and as long as there is the welfare state. And that's because the state is basically distorting the incentives and distorting the reasons people move and travel. If we think about a time in immigration where it was a purely libertarian immigration policy, we think about the early days of America, when there was the race to the West and there was that effort for the American government to start to settle the Midwest and later on the West in what was still very dangerous Indian land, very dangerous wilderness weather, and a native population who weren't very happy about that idea. And so the kinds of people who were migrating to America were basically going to traveling to America, being given a small amount of goods and, like a wagon, a couple of horses, some materials, and they were said, go west, have a good life. And a lot of them never came back, and a lot of them suffered a very grim fate, and they knew that that was a risk. So the policy settings of America at that time were by nature, by incentive, encouraging entrepreneurial people who were prepared to take calculated risks, people who weren't happy where they were living and wanted to move somewhere else, not because it was going to be easier and not because it was going to be a life where they'd be taken care of and they wouldn't have to worry about the things they were worrying about in Europe. They were often moving into a more dangerous situation. And that created natural incentives for the number and makeup composition of migration to be the right mix for that environment in America. Much later on, when you had a far greater state size, you had a far greater welfare state, suddenly you're not necessarily looking at people who are making a decision to move and migrate to a country because they want to make a new life and they want to be entrepreneurial and they want to contribute to that existing society. Sometimes today we have settings in the West where we have welfare and we have settings that really run the risk of providing perverse incentives and having far more people than would otherwise migrate if it were a higher threshold or a more significant investment on their part. And you also have people, when they get here, often not contributing to the existing society and making life better. And the government has a lot to answer for there as well. People respond to incentives not because they're good or bad. People just respond to the incentives that exist. So if the government's saying, well, we've decided that the shortage in skills we have is massage therapists and hair salon operators or barbers, which is included in the list, in the most recent list of skilled migrants the government's released that they're targeting. Like, it's not the fault of the barbers or massage therapists that they're going like, oh, the Australian government's saying they want more of us here, we're going to go there. Like, that's the fault of the government, because the government's claiming to know what Australian industry needs and what Australia's interests are when it comes to who they're trying to target. And they're completely wrong. And they're distorting and disrupting and basically failing in the same way that every area the government tries to take central command and control has failed. So basically, our migration policy, accordingly, we propose that there should be a migration fee. So that is that there be a price, a much larger price than is currently paid. There's a small fee payable now for migrants if you want to migrate to Australia, but that's kind of more like a processing fee or an administrative fee. It's not a fee that's intended to reflect the cost to the existing society and the existing infrastructure and public goods. That is the real cost of each per head migrant. The government currently measures GDP, measures the productivity of Australia and of our country without taking into account what's called per capita GDP. So per capita GDP is how productive the country is per person. Instead, the government chooses to use the measure of how productive, how much economic activity is there in the country overall, without dividing it by the number of people that are here. So that decision, and it's a conscious decision, has the effect of incentivizing the government to promote policies of mass migration and much larger numbers of migrants in order to generate activity, in order to generate economic activity that allows them to say, oh, look, we're not in a recession, we're in a 0.2% GDP growth. When if you divided that by the number of people that now live in Australia, you would absolutely see, as is the case, a drop in productivity and therefore in living standards in real terms. So we say that essentially the measure of GDP should shift to per capita. And we say that the best way to make sure that those who come to Australia come with the right mindset, are equipped to either make a life for themselves and start a business or quickly find jobs, or actually are sponsored by the businesses and employers who have a real gap here in Australia, who have gone and found someone to sponsor from overseas. Because at the moment, we have the government bringing in this cohort of supposed employment pool to fix this supposed shortfall or need. And what happens is, and we've all experienced this, you end up in a car driven, in an Uber, driven by a migrant who has a physics degree, who basically came over here to work a highly skilled job because they were found to be part of that skilled migration quota, but they weren't actually matched to an employer or a real need and gap that existed here. It was just hypothetical speculation that the government basically decided they had a crystal ball and knew exactly that this number of people who were qualified this way would be needed to fill the demands of Australian industry. So what our policy is, the migration fee, really incentivizes business to seriously think about, do we have a real skills shortage? Because if we do have a real skills shortage, it's worth it for us to pay this migration fee, which could be anywhere as much as $100,000. That puts a real skin in the game for the employer. They're going to actually think, you know what, is it worth, or should I actually really turn my mind to investing in training and education here in Australia? Should I take on an apprentice? Should I partner with a TAFE or a university and say, look, we've got this skills gap. We want to provide some funds to allow you to train a pool of suitable candidates, because suddenly you have a cost to them not doing that. So if there's a genuine gap, if there's a genuine need to fill the gap with overseas migrants, then you're actually putting that cost on business and on industry and not on the government, not on all of you, all of us. So it actually creates some really good incentives for training and productivity gaps as well. So we'll come back to this area. I know I've kind of gone a little bit more into it. As you can probably tell from hearing me talk about it, I'm actually really excited to talk about this area of policy, because I think our policy solution, and there's more than just the migration fee and there's more than just the numbers, and I'll go into those when we talk about this policy. We also propose changes to the amount of time it takes to become a citizen. So we say it should be a 10-year wait to be able to apply for citizenship. That is a significantly longer wait than currently is the case. We also say that the vast majority of access to the welfare state should be reserved for people who are citizens, that you shouldn't be able to obtain the benefit of the welfare state, that is, be supported by the taxpayers of the existing society, unless you have been in the country for a period of time and been fending for yourself. We shouldn't be bringing people into the country who need help within a 10-year window of arriving. That's not what we're designed. That's not what migration should be doing. It should be benefiting the existing society. So I'll come back to that, and we'll unpack each of the points in the immigration section when we go back through in detail. But yeah, I'm really, really keen to talk about it. And our solution is not just a numbers game. It's not just a race to the bottom. It's not just let's say that the system should be run by better people, because in the end, even if the system was run by the best people in the world, it will be run by your enemies and people you disagree with at least 50% of the time. So we need to design a system that actually survives bad faith people managing and manipulating the system. Otherwise, we're just going to end up in exactly the same position as we were. Even people who advocate for net zero migration or a complete freeze or pause on migration, we had that experiment through COVID. We had at least 18 months of closed borders, and it didn't help our lives. It didn't bring housing prices down. It didn't solve cost of living. And what happened as soon as that period ended was we saw the period we've had in the last couple of years where intake and migration numbers went through the roof to compensate for the period of time that the borders were closed. And that's what would happen if an incoming Greens or Labor government, for instance, got in and decided to simply shift the pendulum the other way. So libertarians at heart want to get into the levers of control of areas of policy, and we want to actually fix the levers. We want to smash or alter where the levers can go so that it doesn't matter who's pulling them. So I'll come back to that in a moment. The next section we're talking about at section 7 is free speech. Now, this one is not going to come as a surprise to anyone. I'm a free speech absolutist. The Libertarian Party believes in all civil liberties, but in particular freedom of speech, which has been under threat and remains under threat. We're implacably opposed to anti-vilification laws that are seeking to be brought in. We're implacably opposed to racial discrimination sections like 18C that already exist. And we are absolutely committed to fighting against any incarnation of misinformation and disinformation laws, and also the age verification laws that have been passed and are set to kick in 12 months from their implementation. So we absolutely commit to fighting all of those. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to have a cabinet meeting or debate particular instances of censorship. We are always against censorship. So free speech includes a commitment to enshrine free speech in the Constitution. There are other rights similar to America that we would eventually seek to entrench, but free speech is the first one, because that would mean that the kinds of attacks on free speech we've seen in recent years couldn't be made. We want to protect the right of medical practitioners to exercise freedom of conscience and to advise freely, not to see the kind of co-opting and bullying both of the medical profession and within the medical profession by each other against their fellow practitioners. And as I said at the beginning, we also support the defunding and privatisation of the ABC and the SBS. So that's a section that I'm sure will be familiar to most of you. In the 8th section of the policy platform, we've got privacy, and that sets out our position when it comes to ending surveillance, abolishing digital ID. So we don't just say that it's good enough now that you supposedly have voluntary provisions in the Digital ID Act, because in reality, it's voluntary in the way that electricity is voluntary. It's voluntary in the way that online banking is voluntary. You don't have to use it, but your life will be much, much less convenient, and it'll become increasingly less convenient if you don't use it. And the government is essentially trying to force an outcome and socially engineer using digital ID laws. We think private business should be free to work out whatever form of verifying identity they want, as they already do and have. But private enterprise is different because they're liable for that. If they do something, or if they allow your private identification to be used in a way that's wrong, or to breach that security, then you can sue them. You're not going to be able to sue the government for the inevitable breaches of privacy that will happen with this government-created honeypot. Importantly, libertarians don't believe we should simply sack Julie Inman-Grant. We think the E-Safety Commission cannot be good. It cannot be improved. It can't be made good. It should be abolished entirely. Any residual child safety or child pornography, those kinds of really horrific things that somehow found their way into an unelected civil bureaucrat's jurisdiction, they should be dealt with by the AFP and by ASIO. So we want to abolish mass surveillance laws, we want to stop the collection of metadata, and we want to, importantly, preserve the use of cash. So all of these things we will come back to line by line in a moment. And then the final section in this is actually the second most exciting one for me. So immigration is something I'm really excited to talk about, but very close behind that is the topic of foreign affairs. So it might sound strange, but in the past, in previous elections, the Libertarian Party's never really had a clear, cogent position on foreign affairs. So that is defense, foreign affairs and foreign relations, and basically also national sovereignty. We shouldn't be signing up to treaties that bind and limit our policy settings. We shouldn't be allowing our constitution to basically be subverted by signing up to external treaties, which the High Court has basically said the government's allowed to do, but we don't think they should be doing it. So we're going to be focusing on making Australia like the Switzerland of the South Pacific. We want to be adopting an Australia first setting when it comes to our foreign affairs, when it comes to our defence. We want to be defining what is in Australia, and most importantly, what is in Australians' best interests much more narrowly. We want a foreign policy that's rooted in peace, in trade, in neutrality and diplomacy. We don't need to be, and we shouldn't be, the deputy of America in the Asia Pacific. That policy, if maintained and the continuation of American bases like Pine Gap and others on our territory will absolutely see us dragged into a foreign war not of our making. And I'm in part running because of how certain I am that in the next 10 to 15 years, we will be on the threshold of war. And I want to make sure that there's a libertarian voice speaking out against it, because I don't think anyone else will. So that also includes relinquishment of membership in international bodies. So we want to be getting out of the UN. We want to be getting out of the Human Rights Convention and the Refugee Convention. We want to be getting out of the World Health Organization and many other bodies that we're involved in currently, that we can much better see to by bilateral negotiated approaches. So all in all, it's a really exciting package. We don't think that Australia should be worried about the world stage and worried about status and prestige and, who we're allies with, who we're, supportive of, all this kind of thing. It's really, really disappointing to me to see both major parties and the Greens obsessed with things that don't relate to the average individual citizen and the struggles they're experiencing. The Libertarian Party is the only party that seems to be recognising the most important priorities for this federal election should be things that help the lives of everyday Australians, not sending billions in funding and material to the Ukraine, not sending massive amounts of foreign aid to Gaza, not involving us in all these causes and all these priorities, which are giant distractions and indulgences. If you've got a drowning person, you need to be a confident swimmer. You need to be in the boat and you need to be capable of saving someone. Otherwise, you'll drown as well. And our country is drowning in the metaphorical sense and in debt in the very real sense. So that's the theme. That's the overarching kind of breakdown at a high level. And I'm looking forward to going through each of our points in a bit more detail.
Prosperity, family, and freedom. Now, I want to say hello to everyone just joining us. Of course, we're live on 3 platforms. You can leave a comment on YouTube. You can leave a comment on Facebook. You can also leave a comment in the post in the nest on Twitter. And for those joining us on Twitter, in about 1 hour or maybe just over, we'll be inviting you to join the conversation as well and ask Jordan questions voice to voice. I won't say face to face. Now, Jordan, let's talk about prosperity first, and let's look at the economy. Now, of course, for those reading along as we talk about the policies, the Libertarian Party makes 45 statements on these policies. So let's start with prosperity and the economy. And the first one, I guess in no particular order, is the Libertarian Party will raise the income tax-free threshold and implement a flat tax rate. What does this mean in practice? How does it benefit the everyday person, Jordan?
So I actually think that this is one of the policies that benefits every single Australian the most. So we basically say that the tax-free threshold should be raised to $50,000. So currently it's significantly lower than that. And we say that instead of having these staggered brackets of taxes, so that is, when your income is X, then the tax bracket will go up to 10% more, 15% more. The problem with tax income brackets is that they're not indexed to inflation. So you have something called bracket creep that happens where you realistically are still doing the same job, you're getting paid more, but not because that money is actually worth more and your work is more productive. You're getting paid more just by virtue of the value of money decreasing and your paycheck increasing because money is worth less. So essentially what that does is it pushes people who aren't doing anything different, who are basically just going up in salary, into a higher tax bracket than they would have been before. So basically that creates a huge amount of complexity. It creates a huge amount of regulatory compliance and waste in the public service as well. So, the ATO spends countless hours and money on the bureaucracy to essentially sort through people's tax returns, all this sort of thing. And the more complicated a tax system is, particularly an income tax system, the more incentives there are for people to try to cheat it and to try to not record income, to try to keep income off the books, to try to minimize tax. There's that really iconic video that all of us will have seen of Kerry Packer in front of the Senate inquiry saying, "You guys aren't doing such good things with the taxes I pay that I want to pay more of it." And part of that's also that if it's too complicated to just pay tax, people will minimize the tax they pay. If we have a flat tax rate, so the 20% tax rate we've listed in our policy, we do note in the document that eventually we'd like to go down to a simplified tax rate of 10%, and just have basically a flat tax rate for income, goods and services, and essentially just have all transactions, including income taxed at a consistent flat rate. But for the moment, taking it down to a 20% flat tax rate is the goal. We've got a question here on YouTube that I'll just raise in the context of this. So Phase 666 says, what flat tax is needed to make sure we aren't in deficit? And I think that's actually the wrong way to frame it. I think all of our political debate and all of our tax discussion is centering around, well, how do we justify, or how do we make what we've got now work? How do we pay for what we have now? And that's actually asking the wrong way around. We need to say, here's a fair and simple and consistent tax rate. How do we actually structure government so that it fits within what we're raising from that? We don't need to be working backwards and justifying our tax system and our tax revenue intake on what we want the government to do. The government should be living within its means, and the government should be providing only what services it needs to. And I can promise that there is so much waste that before services are even affected, we will be able to reach this kind of taxation setting. So when it talks about 100,000 combined income for couples, this is actually a really important point. And a couple of people have asked questions about this over the last couple of days. Craig Kelly did a post about this a few days ago. What we're actually proposing is that when you have two members of the family, you have mum and dad, for example, and one parent or one member of the couple wants to stay home and chooses not to work, we say that they shouldn't have their tax-free threshold simply thrown away, which is what currently happens. So we basically say that instead of having one person get a tax-free threshold of 50,000 and the other person simply miss out on the tax-free threshold they would have otherwise benefited from, the family should be able to pool that and allow for a combined $100,000 tax-free threshold for the family. Now, we've had this policy for a long time. It's always been one of our policies, and we're putting it again in this policy document. Today, Pauline Hanson announced that she was going to be doing income splitting for tax-free threshold purposes. Flattery is the best compliment, and we're always happy to see other parties taking up our long-term policy. The UAP did that a couple of times at the last election as well, but rest assured that is a fundamentally libertarian principle.
Jordan, let's move on to another thing that the Libertarian Party will do for the economy, and that is to simplify business taxes by taxing only distributions. Tell us a little bit about what that means, who does it affect, and how does it benefit our country?
Yeah, so the second point, sorry, I was talking for a second without the microphone off there. So the second point, at face value, some people might think it's a bit of a shocking thing to say when we say the company tax rate should be reduced to zero. But it's really important to unpack that for a little bit and understand how company tax and company income is currently dealt with. So company tax is paid by companies as a separate legal entity when they declare a profit. In fact, in practice, what happens is that when shareholders of a company receive a dividend, so when they actually receive the distributed profits of a company, so when a company decides that it's going to issue a dividend to its shareholders and pay them back a share of its profits based on their shareholding, there's a mechanism called a fully franked dividend or franking credits that's built into that. So basically, at the moment, when someone who has shares in a company receives the income from that company, they basically don't get taxed on that transaction because it's called a fully franked or franking credit transaction. So they essentially get a discount off their income tax because the company's already paid that tax. So essentially, in practice, the company tax rate is already 0. And we're simply suggesting that at the 20% lower flat tax rate we're introducing, that's when the tax should be paid. When the dividends are declared, the 20% tax is paid on the dividends by the recipients, the shareholders. And so the company is being taxed when it's profitable and when it's distributing the income and profit of its earnings down to the shareholder level. So that has the advantage of also being able to be applied to trusts and partnerships. And so in essence, you're not getting these situations where you have a small mum and dad business, which once upon a time would have been, either a sole tradership or a partnership. Nowadays, you actually have a situation where these small, tiny two-person businesses will be dealt with as a company. We'll have an accountant set up a shelf company for these businesses, when in reality, it's not really a separate legal entity. It's just these two people working. And the reason that's done is for tax purposes, and it creates a huge amount of confusion. And it also creates a lot of legal disputes, which I see every day in my civil litigation work as well. So this basically simplifies. It says that the 20% tax rate should apply to dividends as well, instead of the system of franking credits. So when we say the company tax rate should be 0, we're not saying that the profits of the company shouldn't be taxed. We're saying that the point at which they should be taxed is when they're distributed as income. And that just creates a huge amount of simplicity, and will allow us to make some of the other changes down the track in terms of scaling back the ATO and cutting a lot of government bureaucracy as well.
Jordan, the next one on this list will certainly open up a lot of options for many Australians, and that is that the Libertarian Party will make superannuation voluntary and remove restrictions as well. Why is this the right thing to do?
So just before I answer that question, I'm just going to quickly answer this question on the stream. Dave G is saying that there's not that many people watching the stream on YouTube. We do have quite a number of people in the X space, Dave, which you might have missed the explanation. So this is actually a stream of an X space, which is a social media platform that's happening on X, which has quite a larger number of participants in that. So we're basically streaming that X space out to YouTube and Facebook to give more people access to it. But also all of these videos will be recorded. We're doing this now in terms of timing because we've released the policies at 5 p.m. today. We want to make sure that we're providing a detailed breakdown of those policies as soon as we can, and to give people the information so that they're not just left guessing and there's not a vacuum of information to fill. So that's the reason why we're doing it now. It's not because we think a lot of people are going to be home, on Australia Day night watching libertarian policy discussion. It's because we want to make sure the information's there for them when they need it. So going back to Preston's question, voluntary superannuation. So the whole idea of super was that the premise of it is that Australians are incapable of managing their own money, and that if not forced by the government to have a portion of their income locked away and managed by a superannuation fund, that essentially they would just piss it up against the wall, and that there would be a massive strain on the future pensions that would need to be claimed, because Australians would just be destitute because they can't manage their own money. That's essentially the justification for superannuation. The government crows that Australia is the only country in the world, developed world, with compulsory superannuation. And I say that's nothing to brag about or write home about, because when superannuation was originally proposed, they said that it's going to be locked away, there's going to be no changes, it's going to be tax-free until you choose to claim it. And of course, every time you basically have changes to this, it is raiding the pool of super. You have a lot of union-dominated industry super funds making massive amounts of money off these super funds. And you essentially have a forced, non-consensual part of your income locked away. It's forced savings. And that's the time when we're in a deep cost of living crisis. And basically, we believe people should have access to their own money. We don't believe the government should be able to deny you what is yours. So individuals should be free to participate in superannuation voluntarily. So some people will choose to basically voluntarily have the portion of their wage they get paid put aside, just as superannuation exists now. But we believe that it should be completely within control of the individual. And they should be able to use their money as they see fit without restrictions. Because my big fear is that in another 10, 15 years, the government will basically be raiding super and will be treating super as a kitty and a piggy bank.
The next point in the economy kind of reminds me of Doge, or Department of Government Efficiency, and that is reducing government participation in the economy. Am I along the right track that this is almost a libertarian Doge for Australia, Jordan?
Yeah, spot on. Except the only thing is that I've often joked since the whole Doge thing came up in the Trump election. I've said that if you had a Doge, if you actually had a Department of Government Efficiency in Australia, it would be firing all these people, but then they'd come back and work for the Department of Government Efficiency, and it ended up becoming this monstrous, inefficient body that would be completely filled with all the people that have been sacked from other things. In Australia, we're lucky. Our system of government means that we don't need a separate department to make cuts. We can simply sell government assets, get government out of the economy, and scale back the role of government. So basically, we can use the proceeds of those sales to pay down debt, because that's one of the best investments we can make. We should not have a future fund. The future fund is speculative future investment that's done with your money, with our money. We've seen already that the future fund is being directed to invest in renewable technologies and being used as a political football, which it should never have been. And that money should not exist while we have. It's like saying you've got a speculative investment portfolio at the same time as you've got crippling debt. It doesn't make sense. And if you're a bank looking at that going, okay, so you're not going to pay us our debts that you owe us, but you're going to go and gamble on the stock market or go to the races, like, it's outrageous. So basically we say the best way is just to get started. If a libertarian government were elected, and we have to be clear, like, we're not going to be winning government at this election. This is our election policy platform for if we one day were in a position to do that. But the cuts can begin immediately, and Australians will not notice a difference to their everyday life.
And of course, last but not least, for the economy, the Libertarian Party will reform energy policy and remove carbon-based regulations. I know that's a big one for many of us. Tell us a little about how that might affect not only energy prices, but also the culture we see from our current politicians about maybe pushing us towards certain directions when it comes to energy.
Look, the reality is that we are now contributing to an infinitely small portion of global emissions. Even if you were someone, and like, I'm not someone who believes that man-made climate change is significant. I think certainly we interact with our environment. We have an impact on our environment, as does all life on Earth. But I don't think we're so special that we nudge the needle miraculously in the last 30 years since we've been measuring it. And you can see the predictions time and time again be proven wrong. But even if you did believe that, even if you thought that this was an important moral challenge, Australia's contribution to global emissions is absolutely tiny. And at the same time, we're more than happy to sell coking coal to China and India. We're more than happy to do all this and to basically make no actual difference, but virtue signal and feel good about ourselves. And that is not a luxury we can afford in a cost of living crisis and in a recession. We believe that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Renewable Energy Target are a massive hindrance and a massive burden on the Australian economy. So they need to be abolished.
Thank you. Now, I want to give Jordan a 2-minute break because he's going to be doing a lot of speaking tonight. So, just a reminder, of course, we're live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. You can leave a comment on all three of those platforms, including by pressing the pinned post in the nest on Twitter. After we go through all the policies, of course, we'll be inviting some people up to join the conversation, ask some questions on these policies, but of course, you can leave a comment as well. Now, Jordan, of course, still on prosperity, let's talk about the libertarian money policy. And again, there's some more statements that the party is making, and of course, things that we can hope to achieve if you're elected, or if we get maybe one day in the future a libertarian government. Now, Let's start off with money, of course. The Libertarian Party will constrain the RBA to focus on a stable money supply. Now, tell me a little bit about why it's not stable now, and what the Libertarian Party will do differently to stabilize it.
So in this field, we think that the RBA is taking into account a lot of things that it shouldn't be considering. That it's considering factors that essentially shouldn't be related to its decision to print money. So what we want to do is we want to essentially modify the charter to force the RBA to consider maintaining a stable monetary supply. So that is that there be a requirement that the RBA essentially not just decide at every opportunity where there's a shortfall or a challenge to print more money. So ultimately, in the long run, look, I'll be honest with you, as an anarcho-capitalist libertarian, I would love to see the RBA abolished. But while it exists, and while we have fractional reserve central banking, we need to defang it, and we need to make it incapable of continuing to harm Australians and our legacy. So, so basically, that's what point one is about. When it comes to limiting government debt, obviously having a debt ceiling and having actual limitations on the amount of debt the government can accrue, that's critical, because at the moment we're seeing the impact of uncapped government debt. And essentially governments now, even in the last term of the Howard government, and I think Howard really has to share a lot of the blame for doing this. He was a fiscal conservative, and he was a Reaganite for most of his term. Had responsible governance, built budget surpluses, and then in his very last term, when he wanted to get re-elected, he just threw that all to the wind and allowed huge amounts of pork barreling, huge amounts of spending. And when the Kevin Rudd government got in, is basically when it all went to absolute hell in a handbasket. He, at the first opportunity when the global financial crisis happened, even though it really didn't impact Australia at all, he jettisoned huge amounts of money buying. There was the laptop payment. Essentially, I was working at Officeworks when that happened, and I remember people coming in to buy laptops for $1,000, $1,200, and it was just crazy to see the kind of gross economic irresponsibility that happened. So we need to limit new debt. We need to pay down significant amounts of debt that we already have. And we need to reduce the borrowing power of the government.
And of course, that was point two that you just touched on, which is limit government debt and prioritize fiscal responsibility. Point three, Jordan, recognize alternative currencies and foster competition. Now, you mentioned that there will be an upcoming Bitcoin policy specifically, but tell me a little bit more about how alternative currencies might compete or be recognized with along with the Australian dollar.
Well, we know that the biggest enemy to any kind of market, and money is no exception, is lack of competition. And at the
We'll just
moment,
check in with Jordan. I
oh,
believe his microphone may
sorry.
be muted, but I think we have you back now. Go ahead.
So the biggest threat to any market, and money is no different, is lack of competition. So one of the biggest problems with the fiat monetary system is that government has complete monopoly over the monetary supply, and forces people to use the Australian dollar essentially to make their purchases. So that means that people have no recourse. They have to basically engage in the fiat system to spend their money. And that's one of the reasons why governments have been so resistant to Bitcoin and so resistant to inflation-proof currency, because basically they don't want to lose their power to devalue the currency. And one of the reasons government loves to devalue currency is because they're the single biggest beneficiary, because they're the single greatest debt holder. And if the value of money goes down, then the value of debt in real terms also goes down. So that's good for government. So we think that giving consumers the choice to have alternative stores of value and to essentially use currencies that are not under the control of the government, that would be a very positive step as well.
Thank you. And of course, we're still we are still on prosperity, but we are getting towards the final part of prosperity. which is of course the energy policy of the Libertarian Party. Now, Jordan, point one is enforce no bans, no subsidies, and I would assume that would include the ban on nuclear. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really the only thing it can mean, because there's no other source of energy that is banned simply because it's supposedly more expensive. The truth is that our nuclear energy ban has its roots in moral panic and sort of environmentalism run wild, and that it really is going to be very simple. It's literally two provisions across two different acts that could be repealed, and nuclear energy would be a viable commercial energy source with the stroke of two strokes of the pen. And this is something that there's a big difference between what the Liberal Party are proposing and what the Libertarian Party are proposing. So the Liberal Party basically say that the government should be getting into the business of energy, and the government should be building and basically running nuclear power stations. Now, we say that if you look at the NBN, if you look at the Snowy Hydro 2.0 scheme, if you look at any number of government infrastructure projects, we can guarantee that the best way for nuclear energy either to never happen or to be done at an immense cost to the taxpayer and not deliver the benefits it should is to put the government in charge. That old saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. We don't want to see that play out with what is probably going to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for nuclear energy. And if the enemies of nuclear energy are right, and if it is too expensive, and if it's not viable, then it shouldn't be built. But the person or the mechanism that should determine that is the free market. And we've already seen, as Australia has started to talk about this debate, we've already seen, for example, Korean firms and Korean manufacturing concerns say that they would be prepared potentially to invest in nuclear energy in Australia and use their expertise and take some commercial risks. So we say, why should the government, or why should the taxpayer, why should you and I foot that risk when Dutton could simply repeal the ban and let the free market do its work? It's going to do it better, it's going to do it more quickly, and it's going to basically allow for the genuine benefits of nuclear energy to come through. But it also, sorry, just quickly, it also, when we say no subsidies, we also say, look, wind and solar, if someone wants to put wind and solar energy on their property and they're properly compensated and they understand the risks of that, they should be able to do that. So we're not saying ban renewables. And I think renewables as a word is a misnomer, because there are a lot of non-renewable components to that. But we're not saying that the government should pick winners and losers and should simply replace one set of subsidies and mandates with another. We're saying that the private market, the free market, should be allowed to function.
And exactly that in point two, which is to abolish renewable energy targets. Now, of course, you just mentioned we're not saying to ban renewable energy, but we are saying that the government shouldn't be putting targets and putting money towards reaching specific targets. Essentially, my understanding of that, Jordan, is the government should stay out of it and let the private sector decide how they can provide the most value to people, and people can decide for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, we are fighting with one hand behind our back with renewable energy targets. And if enough people in the Australian, so all of these Simon Holmes Accord, all of the people who are pro renewable energy targets and all that sort of thing, if that's something they care about and they want to continue to support energy options or energy companies to invest in those options, they are free to do that. And if enough people do that, there will still be a market for energy that complies with emissions reduction targets. Like an example is, if you're buying a Jetstar ticket, for example, or a Virgin Airlines ticket within Australia, you can tick a button on there that says, I want to offset my emissions. So you can actually, if you're someone who is environmentally minded, thinks it's important, thinks it's real, you can tick that button and you can pay that cost. More power to your arm. You know what I mean? So basically, that is something that we say the private market can still provide. If enough people genuinely care about that and want to invest in that and spend their money, they can. It just shouldn't be all members of the society who don't necessarily agree with that.
Now, point three, we've certainly already touched on, which is to repeal the blanket ban on nuclear energy in Australia. I think that goes without saying, and I think you touched on it very well a moment ago. But point 4 is to protect the environment from wind and solar projects on public land. Tell us a little bit, Jordan, because I think we've all seen videos on X and other platforms about some of the damages that these projects do to the environment and to wildlife, especially as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we say that the wind and solar projects on public land are really things that have significant impacts on our natural environment. We're seeing scenarios where, in Queensland, for example, things that would never be approved on private land, clearing of trees, um, real like upturning of the earth, tilling the earth without putting proper topsoil on top of it, all these kinds of things that would never be permitted in private land are being done on public land solely to meet renewable energy targets. And another example is carbon capture. This idea that you can build all these, or you can have all these kinds of trees and things like this that exist to capture carbon. So you're essentially taking up valuable land and land that is publicly owned land with these massive dedicated carbon sinks. There's a huge impact to the environment. And while we say that the private market certainly should allow people to do what they want with their own private enterprise, that we should not have wind and solar projects on public land.
Now, those are the libertarian policies on prosperity. Jordan, before we move on to family and freedom, we do have a few questions on Twitter in the comments section about prosperity, of course. ND asks, I would say 90% I agree with your policies. How do you propose to overcome housing issues we are currently encountering?
I'm sorry, could you read that question again? Or could you say that question again?
Absolutely. ND asks on Twitter, I would say 90% I agree with your policies. How would you propose to overcome housing issues we are currently encountering?
So I think that with housing, there's three key areas where big changes need to be made in order to solve the housing supply and affordability issue. One of them is obviously dealing with NIMBY councils at a local government level and dealing with state government planning failures. Those things are absolutely having a massive impact on housing supply and availability. So that's the supply side. The other side is the demand side, and we do need to look at immigration settings that are going to allow our supply issues and problems to be repaired and to catch up. At the moment, we're pouring gasoline on a fire, and the left and even a lot of the major parties basically are in complete denial that that's a problem. And it obviously is. You can't talk about just supply without also talking about demand. And if you have a system or if you have a sector where the supply issues are already very bad, and I mentioned earlier, during COVID, we had a period of time where there was no input of people, and we still had massive failures, and we had prices going up in that time, and we still had massive delays and massive problems in building new homes. So it is absolutely two sides of the coin. Supply and demand both have to be addressed. And libertarians are not like the major parties and the Greens, where we deny the importance of supply and demand. They both need to be tackled at the same time. But there's also a third thing that libertarians uniquely recognise, which is that there is a hidden cost to government big build infrastructure projects. I work for my day job in commercial litigation, and we do a lot of construction disputes. And one of the things that comes out every time in a lot of these disputes is that you have a competition crowding effect with government infrastructure builds. So basically, you have a situation where the government is hiring from the pools of people that are the same pools of people that build commercial projects and domestic homes. The government is paying those people a lot more money. They also are taking up from the same pool of resources. So, wood, steel, iron, frames, all this kind of thing. And so when you have these massive government big build infrastructure projects, it acts as like a vacuum kind of sucking away resources that would otherwise be directed to a really important need, which is domestic homes. If you're an apprentice, or if you're a tradie, or if you're an engineer, would you work on a domestic project, or would you work on a government big build site that earns 3 times as much? So basically that's absolutely massive. So those three things together, so government crowding out of private infrastructure, the demand issue when it comes to we are actively trying to grow our population through significantly higher migration numbers than we've had for a long period of our history, at the same time as we're struggling with the supply side of housing already. So all three of those things together, Libertarians are the only ones who recognise all three.
Cami Lopez on X asks or mentions that Bitcoin has been in use for at least a decade. Jordan, how does the libertarian position and policy on alternative currencies benefit people who may already be using things like Bitcoin?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And as I said, we will have a separate Bitcoin policy that will make some of those answers clear. One of the ways in which the Libertarian Party's policy position on Bitcoin will benefit users of Bitcoin is we want to abolish capital gains tax on Bitcoin transactions. We don't believe it should be treated like an asset that is going up in value. We believe it should be treated like a currency and a store of value, which it is. So that's one way that our policies will make a huge difference. That's something we've long advocated, so that's not new policy. So that's why I use that as an example. There's other exciting things that we're going to be talking about that might involve Bitcoin mining and other topical things that we've talked about with the community. So basically, I think that there is a lot of, and it's interesting in the YouTube chat here, you guys on X can't see this, but Handsome Monkey King is saying, he has, or they have crypto that they actually want to cash out and spend in Australia, but they don't want to have that CGT event and take that tax hit. So I think there's a lot of hidden wealth that could be spent in the economy and that could be benefiting Australians, but is just waiting for those settings to happen.
And the final question. Go ahead, Jordan.
Sorry, no, you go.
A final question on prosperity from Twitter in a message I've received is how can we ensure that we can still pay for everything if the Libertarian Party is cutting taxes?
Well, the answer to that will sound like it's a silly answer that I'm giving you, but it's not. The answer is to have a lot less things to pay for. If you're in a household budget, and all of us are at the moment, where times are tough, you're getting less income, or your employer pays you less or whatever, you're going to cut spending. The government has so much that we're spending and so much that we're wasting money on, but there's no incentive to cut that. And the only way to really genuinely force the government to live within its means is to reduce the tax take, is to actually cut taxes, return money to the pockets of the Australians who are earning the money, and force the government to work backwards from that, to say, here's what you have to spend, you decide what you can live without and what you want to prioritize. And you'll see their conduct and their behavior change very quickly.
Thank you, Jordan. And that is the libertarian policies and some questions on prosperity. Of course, I'd want to give Jordan a 60-second break. As I say that we're going to move on to family next.
I might actually, I'm going to very quickly make myself a coffee. If you want to have a quick chat, or if you want to maybe just get anyone's thoughts, or actually, Lachlan Lade is joining us as well. He's our Queensland Senate candidate. I'd love to hear a little bit of what he thinks about this section, the prosperity section of our policy. I'm just going to bring Lachlan up. Where are we here? Sorry.
Thank you. And while you're doing that, Jordan, of course, we will have Jordan back in a moment or two. He's doing a lot of speaking tonight, and he's been speaking all day long. I believe he was at multiple Australia Day events, celebrating Australia Day, of course. And the next thing we are going to be talking about, we've spoken about prosperity. We've had a few questions about that as well. We're going to be speaking on family next, and that will encapsulate education, women and children, and immigration. Now, I don't believe we have Lachlan coming up, unfortunately. And I believe Jordan has left his microphone open. So hopefully he can hear me and he mutes his microphone because there is a little bit of background noise. But just a reminder, of course, you can follow Jordan Ditloff, the Libertarian #1 Senate candidate for Victoria. As he mentioned, we also have Lachlan Lade, who is the #2 Senate candidate for the Libertarian Party in Queensland. Now, I apologize for the noise. Unfortunately, Jordan has left his microphone open and he's unfortunately walked away from his desk. You can also follow the Libertarian Party account that I'm speaking on now. Up in the Nest, for those on X, Up in the Nest is all the policies we're speaking about tonight. I would encourage everyone to leave a comment on that post, and also share your thoughts, ask more questions as well on that post. We may not get to every question tonight, although for those on Twitter, we will have some people come up and join the conversation as soon as we touch on family and freedom. I believe we may have Jordan back coming back momentarily. So just a reminder, we've spoken about prosperity, we've spoken about economy, money, and energy. Next, of course, we'll be talking about family, education, women and children, and immigration. And finally, we'll be talking about the freedom section, which encompasses free speech, which is what I'm most excited about, privacy, and foreign affairs. Now, I'll just check in with Jordan and see if we have him back
Yes,
or
we
not.
do have us back. I thought I had it muted as well. So if you heard cats screaming in the background like they've never been fed before in their life, they were lying.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'll give you another 15 or 20 seconds just to take a sip of your coffee. Of course, I mentioned how you were at multiple Australia Day events celebrating Australia. And of course, we wish all our listeners here on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube a happy Australia Day as well. Now, Jordan, we've spoken about prosperity, of course. We've had a few questions on prosperity. Next, I want to touch on family. And of course, one of the first topics in family is education. The first point under education is that the Libertarian Party will abolish the Federal Department of Education. Jordan, tell us maybe where is the Federal Department of Education going wrong, and why should it be abolished?
Well, Preston, where it's going wrong is that it exists. So, as a law graduate and as someone who is a constitutional law aficionado and someone who's very interested in the decisions that our government made or our founding fathers made when they were shaping our system of government, Australia is a federation. It has a clear division of responsibilities between education, between states and between federal. And where something was basically not in the constitution, it was meant to be left to the states to manage. So that's why states manage things like state courts, police, education, health. Those things were originally intended to be left to the states to manage. Now, the federal government over the years has basically expanded what it takes a responsibility for and what it has input into well beyond its original intention, which was basically to deal with only things that the states needed a federal government to deal with. And one of the ways it does this, there's two ways, which both will be relevant for this policy document and things we're going to talk about in a moment. The first way it expands its power is through external treaties. So treaties like the UN Convention on Refugees, etc., UN Convention on World Heritage, all those kinds of things. Those are one way that the federal government has been granted the ability to basically expand their powers beyond what the Constitution gave them in the black letter law of the Constitution. The second way, and I think the much sneakier way, is that they use what's called special purpose grants. That is, grants that the Constitution allows the federal government to make to the states, but the federal government has essentially over time used those carrots to get the states to agree to give them responsibility and involvement in different policy areas. So education is a really easy one. It's low-hanging fruit because the states already deliver the services. The states are already in practice responsible for education. And all the federal government has done is impose top-down regulation in the form of national curriculum, which the results speak for themselves. It does not work. It's delivered worse outcomes for students and for schools. And they basically control funding and restrict funding to manipulate what gets taught, to manipulate how services are delivered. Basically, the Federal Department of Education is like the worst micromanaging boss you've ever had when it comes to education. So it's a really, really easy one for libertarians because it shouldn't exist. It doesn't provide any added value. And the services it delivers could be delivered more efficiently by the states. And if a state doesn't deliver that service efficiently and another state does better, then people will vote with their feet and they'll say, you know what, New South Wales is a great place to have our kids go to school because they're getting great results. So we're going to move to New South Wales. And then suddenly Victoria goes, well, Victoria probably won't because it's a socialist hellhole. But in theory, Victoria would go, oh, damn, we're losing citizens. Like, we're losing members of Victorian population to another state because they are doing something better than us. And so you're creating that competition. You're creating an incentive for states to deliver positive education reform and to deliver strong results, where at the moment that just doesn't exist because it's the top down. Everyone is free to fail equally in our current federal education system.
And talking about control that parents should have over their child's education, point 2 is to empower parents to control childcare and education funding. Tell me a little bit about how that would work and why parents should have that control.
Well, at the moment, federal funding, or all funding for education, basically goes directly from the government to the schools. So theoretically, there's a per child per head amount each year that is allocated to that child for funding. Now, by that going directly to the schools, the parents essentially are cut out of that game. Like, they basically have to go to a particular school within their zone. Like, they either have to travel a crazy area to go to an unzoned school, or they're like forced to go to a state school in their area. So we think that's very inequitable, and we think that that actually creates an environment where parents don't feel like they can vote with their feet. So they can't actually choose the school and reward the school that's right for them and their kids, that basically supports their values and what they want to be taught. So too often we see situations where schools are essentially dictating to parents what is the right fit for their children, and they're not responsive to parental feedback and parental preferences. So our policy basically proposes that a voucher with the equivalent value of the funding assigned to that student be given to the parents, and the parents can then take that voucher to a school that suits their needs best. And so that creates a competitive environment where schools are competing for funding, and the parents, not the government, are the ones that the school has to make happy. Now, this might sound like a bit of a pie in the sky policy, but actually it is being tried in Florida and a couple of other key states in America, and it works very well. It's been very effective over there at improving the standards of what they call charter schools, which is like private schools, and government schools as well.
Now, Jordan, I remember the first time I met you was at a seminar on education, and it's very fitting for point 3, which is to encourage new and innovative education models. How would this benefit our country as a whole if we can encourage this for our children, Jordan?
So that event that we met at was actually for an organisation called Classical Education Australia, and they advocate for returning to the Latin classics, to teaching the way that education was taught for a very long time, up until the early 20th century. And what our policy says is that they should be free to have a curriculum that is approved, that works for them, and that allows them to deliver that product. But going beyond just like high school as well, we have a very, very anti-innovation system. Like, our universities are a closed shop. The government basically has to approve new universities. You can't just go and create a university. Like, one thing that I've often been struck by over the last couple of years is that there are good academics in every university, but there's not a university where all the academics are good and where they can actually congregate and gather and actually start a university that is more more classically liberal, more focused on a different agenda to the kind of university agendas we often see pushed. So the reason is that it's very, very difficult for new universities to start. So we say that there is no special, universities are providers of service and education product. We should have a free market in education. It should be up to the market to decide whether a degree is valuable or not. So we say that basically allowing for competition in education will take away this idea, like, the government keeps saying that education is an export, that like we're an exporter of education. But what that really means is there's huge incentives for universities to have lower standards for full fee paying international students that undermine the quality of those degrees for all students and essentially turn us into a degree farm. That's pretty much the way our country is run at the moment.
Now, I know you briefly mentioned homeschooling, and very fitting for point 4, which is to support home education co-ops. Now, I know there are many parents who would love to homeschool their children, but are maybe finding that to get into it is quite restricting or difficult. How can the Libertarian Party support people who want to homeschool their children, or co-ops and micro schools, as the policy mentions?
So absolutely, and I don't have kids yet. Georgie and I, we had talked about trying to get pregnant during the campaign, and I kind of told her that was probably not a good idea, and she was like, "No, no, it'll be fine." And then as we've gotten into the campaign, she's like, "Okay, I'm sorry, you were right. This is like would be a disaster." But we're very close to looking to start a family, and when we do, we definitely want to homeschool. I've met wonderful parents and kids who have homeschooled, and those kids are basically all the evidence you need that homeschooling can be really beneficial when it's possible for parents. It's not possible for everyone, but for parents that do want to take a more active hand in their kids' education, they should absolutely be free to do that. And homeschooling currently is pretty permissive, like the settings are pretty open. But where it starts to get to be a problem is where you get parents who want to homeschool pooling their resources to do co-ops and micro schooling. That's a very grey area when it comes to the legislation and regulation. And we want to make it beyond doubt that parents or communities, whether it be a remote community or whether it be a faith-based community or whatever, can basically pool their resources to provide the schooling experience for their families and their children that they want to. So that allows flexibility. Even you could have online resources and kind of like online classrooms for homeschooling, all that sort of thing. So yeah, we basically say that home education should be facilitated and encouraged. It's a great solution for many people.
Last but not least is point 5 on education, which is that the Libertarian Party will place the cost of university on those who benefit. And of course, we've all seen maybe certain other parties in government say that they are giving a $2,000 forgiveness to university debts. But in reality, it's us, the taxpayer, who are paying for that, isn't it, Jordan?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever the government tells you that something is free, remember that you're paying for it. It's taxpayer funded. And I actually think it's not in our policy thing, but I think a great libertarian innovation is what Malay did, where he basically said that, from under his administration, nothing would be referred to as free, it would be referred to as taxpayer funded. So I think that language would be helpful here as well. Just before I answer your question, though, there's a great comment or question from Owen Miller, who is a member of the Fusion Party, who's on the stream here having a look. And he said, Jordan, what do you think of the government providing more transparency about outcomes in tertiary education? And he goes on to say, if someone studies a particular course, what is their job title, or what kind of jobs did they get, and what is their income average 5 years later? I actually think that's a terrific idea. And I think more accountability and more openness from universities about what postgraduate outcomes or what graduate outcomes are in reality would be very, very beneficial. I think that's a terrific step. And it kind of relates to this point, the 5th point that Preston was asking about is, if you want to have a loan, and if it is to be a government loan for now, then that loan should be conditional. It shouldn't be that everybody can simply have access to a delayed payment government loan, regardless of whether or not they actually want to put that degree to productive use. If you want to benefit from a payment scheme over time, a government loan, you should only be able to access that if you commit to paying it back. And very quickly, you'd see less of that kind of fee help HEC style loan being advanced to non-commercial, non-productive degrees.
Thank you, Jordan. And of course, that is the education policies for the Libertarian Party. If you have any questions, comments, you can leave them on YouTube, Facebook, and on Twitter. But the next topic under family is women and children. And point 1, Jordan, is straight away to restore the legal definition of woman. And I'm sure this is a very important one that we've seen recently happen in the US. Are we certainly on the right track to follow the example of what's happening in the US and around the world, and correct just biological sex?
Yeah. So look, Yeah, so look, I certainly agree that this is headed in the right direction. I should stress, I didn't write the policy document in full, and as a legal practitioner, I'm a little bit dubious about whether this policy is worded the right way and would have the impact that it seeks to have. But what it's saying is that we commit to restoring a biological definition of sex, and if necessary, legislation would be amended to take into account the case law that has developed over time and that we saw reaffirmed in the Tickle v. Giggle case. So I think that as worded, this policy is a little bit questionable if it really grasps the legal necessities the right way, but the principle of returning to a biological definition of gender, that is something the Libertarian Party supports. And it's also got information in there about the inability to change government-issued identity documents. At the moment, essentially, that's treated as though it's sort of an irrelevant thing that can be changed quite readily. So that's what that policy means. I actually think the second policy point is one of the most important things we can do to address this issue very quickly, and that is to ensure that the ability to have single gender, not only women, of course, but there are also men's only spaces, both in terms of, for example, gay clubs, sex on premises venues, members clubs like the Australia Club and others. And I think making sure that it is possible to have single gender only spaces and have exclusions to basically allow groups of women to exclude the opposite gender. That is really important, and also making sure that the exemptions are very robust so people can seek an exemption. If there is going to be a general discrimination provision, that groups and organisations can basically apply for an exemption, because that gives them that protection, and it does it in a way that really allows them to maintain that space that's safe for them. So I think really making sure that the right to exclude is protected and enshrined, I think that's a very libertarian principle, and I think I'd be very supportive of that.
Thank you. And of course, that is point 2, which is to protect women's only spaces. Point 3, Jordan, is to keep the government out of public bathrooms. And on principle, I say keep the government out of everywhere, but certainly keep the government out of public bathrooms. Tell us a little bit about that policy.
Yeah, I had to explain the Libertarian Party to someone the other day when I was picking up something at the storage unit for the party, and I keep forgetting my face is on the side of the van. And every so often I'll have conversations with people standing next to the van. They're like, "Oh, that's you." And they're like, "What's Libertarian? Like, how is that different to Liberal?" was what this guy asked. And I said, "Look, basically, we are like what the Liberal Party says in the packet, except that we believe the government should stay out of the economy and out of your bedroom. Like, it's none of anyone's business what you do in your private life." And he goes, "Oh yeah, cool." He liked that. He said, "Good on you." So, and I think this falls into that category. Essentially, these things can be dealt with as a matter of engineering and construction. Ideally, like if you go to airports, for example, private facilities, they just have single use. They just have single use toilets. So it doesn't matter because you're not sharing the toilets with anyone anyway. It says where demand warrants it, there might be separate accommodations. But look, in reality, I think it's primarily an engineering and construction issue. There shouldn't be a requirement in all public spaces for that kind of separation. And if I can, I've got a comment here. Despite some initial early impatience, and I'm sorry if I took that the wrong way at all, or if you felt we were kind of being hard on you there, Handsome Monkey King. Handsome Monkey King says, "Very cool. The Libertarian Party is looking fantastic. I see it as max freedoms, but not if they harm another's freedoms." And I wanted to highlight that because that's a great summary. That's a great sort of golden thread that runs through everything. Javier Milei put it really well, where he said, "Libertarianism is about the unrestricted respect for the life projects of others, as long as they're not harming anyone else." So I totally agree.
And completely agree. What an amazing summary. And one thing you've said to me in the past, Jordan, is if you're not sure about a policy, just remember that phrase, and you'll be able to take a very good guess at what the policy will likely be. Now, Jordan, let's continue with women and children under family. And point four is to protect women's sports with female only categories. And of course, we've seen how dangerous this can be with mixed sex sports. Tell us a little bit about why this is important.
Yeah, look, I am a big fan of mixed martial arts. I watch a lot of UFC and Bellator and PFL and all that sort of thing. And you don't have to think very hard to imagine the kind of devastating consequences when it comes to like physical blood sport. Obviously, that's the most extreme example. But it's also really important that biological women who have trained and worked and devoted themselves to being the best in their field their whole life, that they essentially be able to preserve women's only spaces in sport. No matter how long before, no matter how long before somebody has been taking estrogen and all that sort of thing, if they still have the benefits of testosterone in their body, that's an immense advantage that you really can't balance out. So yeah, we are committed to women's rights in sport and female-only categories in sport.
Point five, Jordan, is to restrict gender transition procedures to legal adults. And I would say it's certainly very important that people are old enough to make a decision and to have consent. So, would you agree with this? It's important that people are mentally developed to be able to give consent for things such as gender transition procedures.
Yeah, so this is a pretty straightforward one, and it's really ironic because for some reason, I don't know, I think it's an American thing. The left and the socialists in Australia always go on about libertarians and the age of consent. Like I've never heard an Australian libertarian raise that as an issue ever. But ironically, at the same time as the left is saying, oh, libertarians are obsessed with age of consent, all this sort of stuff, they're totally happy to say that children are capable of giving consent to life-altering procedures or even social transitioning in schools without the consent of their parents. So-called mature minor legislation and provisions, it's just insane. Like, we say that taxpayers shouldn't be funding those kinds of treatments, and medical professionals should be able to exercise their conscience. We oppose the affirmation-only model, and not only do we oppose it, and David Limbrick has said this as well, and I agree, I would be pretty unsurprised if in as little as 10 to 15 years, we're seeing civil suits and negligence, medical malpractice lawsuits against clinics and doctors who have recommended this kind of legislation in the reckless way that they have so far. I'd be shocked if that didn't happen. So we absolutely believe that children cannot consent to life-altering surgery, hormone replacements, and even things like social transitioning in schools should not be done without parental consent.
And last but not least, the Libertarian Party will protect the freedom to provide appropriate counselling. And certainly we see maybe counsellors, psychologists, etc., who are maybe very limited on what they are allowed to say. So, Jordan, my understanding of this is that counselors and those alike in similar fields will be allowed to use their best professional skills to help people through decisions like this.
Yeah, so what this really addresses is the affirmation-only model that was put in place by the so-called gay conversion therapy bans, which really go a lot further than that and essentially make it certainly at face value illegal to advise somebody not to affirm their gender or change their gender. But it also goes a lot further than that because you have a chilling effect where legitimate mental health counselling, and this is one thing that the Cass Review found pretty consistently, that essentially rather than treating the issue of gender dysphoria and gender uncertainty and all that sort of thing as any other sort of health issue would be treated, which is holistically with triage and multiple health professionals and sort of gradually escalating interventions and so forth. Instead, just going straight to gender affirming care, you're going to have hormones or surgery. That is obviously not best practice, and to basically put in place legal settings that are going to impact the ability of medical professionals to do the kind of counselling and holistic medical care that they would otherwise do is very wrong.
Thank you. And of course, they are the policies of the Libertarian Party on women and children. Now, I want to give Jordan just a moment before we head into immigration, because I know not only everyone in the space is excited to hear about this, but I know Jordan is very excited to speak on it.
Just before we
And
go
of
on to that,
course-
Preston, I was thinking, because like I imagine immigration is something we're going to probably discuss for quite a bit, and I'm even happy once I do sort of go through the immigration discussion, to have a dedicated little chat after that as well, because I'm not under any illusion that free speech, privacy, and foreign affairs are going to be as spicy or as interesting to people. So like I'm keen to recognise where the majority of the interest will be. I was wondering, in light of that, whether we wanted to do some quick questions on the policy areas we've covered so far, whether anyone has any feedback or questions or thoughts, and then we can go on to the immigration thing, rather than have to try to remember all the questions people might have had about previous things.
Of course, and we are on 3 platforms. Of course, we are live streaming on YouTube, so you can leave comments on YouTube. Jordan will read those out. We're also on Facebook, and Jordan will also read the Facebook comments out. And of course, we're on Twitter, and you can leave comments by clicking on the post in the nest. Of course, very, very soon, we'll be inviting some people up to join the conversation. But if you do have any questions on the policy topics we've spoken about so far, leave them as a comment, and we'll wait about 2 or 3 minutes before we move on to immigration to see if any questions come up. And of course, make sure to follow Jordan Ditloff, who is the lead Senate candidate for Victoria for the Libertarian Party. Make sure to follow this account, which is the Libertarian Party account. And Jordan, is there any questions popping up on YouTube or Facebook? And of course, you can leave comments on Twitter as well.
No, we've sort of been dealing with some of them as we go in the chat. So I will read this one out from Ben Robson. Ben says, I can't see any mention of the NDIS in the policy platform. While the NDIS provides a lot of services people in need, the scheme is very expensive and is reportedly rife with financial misuse. Yeah, you're right, Ben. That didn't form part of our final policy platform for this election. It doesn't mean that we're completely happy with how things have been and how things may be in future. I'm really very keen to watch carefully and take note of what impact the reforms recently passed by Bill Shorten have, to see whether that makes any difference or whether that improves things. I suspect that there may still be significant issues, and it's certainly a policy area I'm very keen to attend to and consider after the election. And we may have a policy position on it prior to that, but for the purposes of this document, that wasn't included.
Now, on Twitter, we have Cami Lopez, who asks, or who mentions, as someone who was homeschooled, the biggest issue is that the Department of Education controls it. There are those who refuse to accept the oversight and are discriminated against. Jordan, I would assume the policy of removing the Department of Education would help those who are being homeschooled as well as those who are going to a traditional school. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you say that question again?
Yes, absolutely. Cami Lopez on Twitter mentions that as someone who was homeschooled, the biggest issue is the Department of Education controls it. And the follow-up question to that, Jordan, is would the policy of removing the Department of Education help those who are homeschooled as well as those who go to traditional schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that homeschoolers stand to benefit from our policies certainly as much as anyone, and I think that resources, like there's a lot of things that are, I think, technically possible under the current settings, but that parents and homeschooling groups are hesitant to approach because they just don't have clarity. They don't really know exactly what's in and what's out. So I do think that the Libertarian policy position on this would help that significantly.
Also on Twitter, Lee Hazel asks, so there would be no income test for repayments on HEX-like loans?
So at the moment, we are stating as our policy position that it would simply be a requirement of receiving such a loan that it be repaid. Certainly, I do think there is something to be said for means testing access to that kind of loan. I think that it does run the risk of becoming middle class welfare otherwise, where the child of two wealthy lawyers in a household earning over 300,000, there's an argument to be made that they might not need to benefit from taxpayer subsidized loans in the same way that others would. So I agree with you. I think that means testing would be a really valuable thing to investigate. At the moment, our policy doesn't go that far, but it certainly would be consistent with our principles.
Thank you. And so those are some questions, of course, on of course, two topics that we've covered so far: prosperity and family. Now we are looking at moving towards the end of family, but before we do, there is, of course, one more topic to cover. And I know a lot of people are excited to hear that. And I know Jordan is very excited to speak about it. Jordan, before we go into the specific points for immigration, would you like to give maybe a bit of a preamble, some thoughts? I know a lot of people were maybe pressing Control F on their keyboard and typing in or searching for net zero. Tell us a little bit about why the libertarian immigration policy competes and maybe is even better than some of the other policies that we see in solving some of the problems we have that relate to immigration.
Yeah, sure thing. And I think, like, to preface this, over the past month in particular, I've had a number of conversations in spaces we've run and with other people where, I've kind of come close to talking about the final shape of that policy. I didn't know exactly what the final exact wording that would be landed on would be, but I knew it would be a policy quite similar to this. And when those conversations have come up, it's really been frustrating for me that I haven't been able to explore them and go into them, because some of the questions I've been getting asked and some of the concerns that have been getting raised, I think, are really valid and valuable. And I think that our policy, first thing I think you have to say is that in policy, you have to deal in reality. And the reality is that even if you had a party gain power or gain the balance of power that advocated for net zero and they were able to achieve that outcome, let's say one nation swept the board and somehow got a couple of lower house seats, and the Liberals did a deal with them to form a coalition government that was, Liberals and Fon in the lower house, right, to guarantee passage of supply. So let's say that happened and Fon was able to implement net zero for a term for 3 years. If nothing changes about the system, right, if all they change is the number and that's it, then all that will happen is that when the coalition lose power, whether it's in 3 years, 6 years, whatever it is, the pendulum will just swing back, and the precedent that's set by that net zero will also support a policy that goes to 3 or 4 times what we're getting now, to, for whatever reason and justification that Labor and the Greens and others would bring in. So it's not enough to simply say what we've got now isn't working and we need to, dig in our heels and sort of tilt for the stars and sort of try to get this policy setting that makes emotive sense to us. It's just not something that is going to solve the underlying problem. And where libertarians see the underlying problem as being is, as in any area of the government or any area of policy all through history, not just in Australia, but in every other democracy we've ever had in the globe, or even not democracies, in socialist countries, anytime the government basically takes command and control of an area and says the government knows best about how to administer this area and how to decide who, what, when, where, and why, that is the recipe for failure. And we are seeing the fruits of decades of failure in our immigration policy that stems from not a decision about how many people or where people come from, but a decision about how that decision is going to be made. Because at the end of the day, if Peter Dutton wins government in April or May, the bureaucrats who run the Department of Immigration are going to be the same. They're not going to come in and clean them out and get rid of all the people who have been overseeing this system and this policy. That's just not going to happen. They're going to be dealing with the same people administering that system. So libertarians are actually looking at this problem and saying, what is the systemic problem? What are the incentives and distortions that have led to the problem we've got now? Now, in 2016, when we were last represented in the Senate, so at that time we had Senator David Lionhelm. So he was our senator when we were the Liberal Democrats, and he was in the Senate in 2016, and he actually referred the question of migrant intake to the Productivity Commission. So I won't share it now in the space, but I will be sharing it either tonight or tomorrow when I do a more detailed post on immigration, so people have the opportunity to have a little look at it. But that inquiry that the Productivity Commission ran and our submission to that inquiry was really, really fantastic, and actually predicted a lot of the problems that we now have if nothing changed. And nothing did change as a result of that report. The final recommendations of the report, when it came to adopting our proposal for a migration fee, basically concluded, and I quote almost, I can't remember the exact word, but they pretty much said, introducing a migration fee would be politically difficult. That's essentially what they said, that it would be basically too hard and that there wouldn't be the political willpower to do it. Now, that might have been true in 2016. I don't think it's true in 2025. I think that people now recognize the very real problems that centralized government planning and migration quotas have caused. And I think that people are really ready for a solution that actually doesn't just, fiddle with the needle, but rewrites the rules of the game. So how would a migration fee work? So a migration fee is the idea that we should be introducing a market signal into who comes to our country. So instead of the government basically closing their eyes with a blindfold and kind of like picking people off the board and saying, oh, this person is appropriate to come, this person is appropriate to come, this type of qualified person, you essentially replace that arbitrary quota with a migration fee, a price that a eligible immigrant who basically passes vetting for links to organised crime, infectious diseases, violent histories, those kinds of checks, terrorism checks. So basically, they have to be vetted. They have to meet that criteria as a baseline. And then, if they are prepared to pay the price, the fee, then they should be able to migrate after payment of that fee. And the advantage that has is that essentially you are selecting for people who are people with the resources to pay that fee, who are either coming to jobs that are prearranged, because as I talked about earlier when we were talking about this, we would envisage that under this scheme, employers would often either loan their employees the migration fee, or they would pay it as part of the terms of that person's employment contract. They would see that as an investment. And so you have people coming to Australia either with the means and resources and skill set to make a life for themselves, to start a business, to be people of means. They're not starting at the bottom of the rung. They're not actually, because where the current migration settings are felt the most keenly is with young people starting at the bottom, with people who are trying to start families, people who are trying to make their way in the world from very, very low or the baseline. If we're bringing migrants into the country or selecting or allowing for migrants to be selected who are essentially competing with that beginning, like lowest rung of existing society, that's where that competition and scarcity is felt the most keenly. Whereas if we're bringing in the nuclear engineers, the future Elon Musks, the people that have the resources and wherewithal to not be competing with people who are trying to get themselves set up and who are already struggling the most in the existing society, I think that's where the migration fee really has a massive benefit. And so we would also see a massive simplification in the visa structure. So at the moment, you have skilled migration visas, you have all this huge plethora of different types of visas. And under our system, that would be dramatically reduced. So we would be talking about migration fee basically replacing all these different categories of skilled workers. You can't see air quotes because you don't have the video of me, but I'm air quoting skilled workers, where the government basically just arbitrarily decides what Australia needs. That arbitrary decision about what Australia needs would be replaced by the market deciding what Australia needs. Employers actually saying, we need a person to fill this job. We're going to, if we can't find them locally, and if we're not prepared to pay less than the migration fee to train someone up and to invest in someone, which a lot more employers will, so that'll solve that problem as well. But we're actually looking at a system where employers can sponsor, can invite guests, instead of having a mandatory obligation to take in refugees. Like we've just seen over 1,000 refugees from Gaza taken in under part of our UN Convention on Refugees commitments. If we didn't have those commitments, we could still take refugees, but those refugees would be sponsored. The migration fee would be paid by families, church groups, aid groups who would be basically vouching for that refugee. So the difference between the government saying we're just going to import 1,000 people from a war zone and organizations who are prepared to invest in and vouch for and sponsor refugees, that is the difference between night and day. And the idea that someone would be better set up for success if they are being sponsored and supported into the community rather than simply transplanted from a war zone into our society, that would be a far, far better way of showing compassion and allowing Australians to do what I think a lot of Australians would do. Australians are very welcoming people. They do want to help others, and they do want to, support people who are struggling and people who are fleeing persecution and all this sort of thing. But the idea that we need to rely on the government to socialise that responsibility out and then just hope for the best and catch and release people. So there's been a question asked in the YouTube chat, which goes on to the thing I wanted to talk about next, which is how would this migration fee be set? Like, how would you decide what the price would be for a migration fee spot? So this is where it's a level of detail that you won't find within the policy document itself, because the policy document is limited in its scope and space. The policy statements are quite brief. And then my job as the candidate is to talk about how that policy would be applied in practice. And this is where people looking for the net overseas migration number and so on, this is where that level of detail comes in, where if we were in a libertarian government and we were going to be introducing this setting and this system, this is the kind of question where we need to have that answer. So in our system, in a migration fee system, the government would have one of two roles when the system is first implemented. Either the government would set the price, and you can probably imagine some of the problems with that, not just from a libertarian point of view, but from a practical point of view. If we said the government was to set the migration fee, then all that would happen is when a government who wanted more migrants came in, they would just set the fee low, right? So they would basically say, we decree that the fee is 20 grand, right? And at 20 grand, you might get migration numbers that are quite similar to what we get now, because it would be very cheap and a very low barrier to migrating. And then therefore you would have that fee be less. You also wouldn't really be certain how many people were going to come, because you'd be setting the price, but not the number. The second alternative in this system and in implementing this system, and the second alternative is the one that I prefer and that I would argue for if I was elected, is that the government would set the initial intake. So the government would basically say, these are the numbers or the range of numbers that we believe is the correct one to begin with. Now, I think there should be a number or an intake number that is initially set and then to be reviewed by the Productivity Commission, keeping in mind we talked about the GDP measure being changed to a per capita GDP, so looking at productivity per person, and then having the Productivity Commission review that initial intake percentage or number in 5 years' time based on how it's going. Now, I think the right metric to decide or to set an initial migrant intake would be best expressed as a percentage of the existing society. And if you look at the trends over the last 30 or 40 years, or certainly since World War II, for the vast majority of Australia's history post-World War II, we were sitting at a migrant intake of roughly around about 1%, 1 to 1.5%, depending on different ebbs and flows. And I think that's actually the right number to begin with to start to introduce a system like this. So to answer your question of how would the fee be set, the way the fee would be set would be that this initial intake, so let's say 1% of the existing population, and then you have around 200,000 to 150,000 people leaving each year. So some people finish on visas they're on that aren't permanent, or some people leave Australia and migrate out of Australia. So every year we have, I think, about 20 or 30,000 Australians actually leave Australia to go and live or work overseas. And that's a big problem as well, because we're losing some of our best and brightest. The people who are able to migrate overseas and do are often the exact sort of people that we would be best off to try to keep in Australia. And we lose a lot when it comes to that brain drain. So I think under not just our immigration settings, but under our whole policy settings, we would actually be retaining a lot more of the best and brightest in Australia, because they'd have somewhere to live, they'd have better employment prospects, they'd be able to invest and earn money. And a lot of the reasons people leave now would be either made better or abolished by libertarian policy settings. But under that 1% migrant intake as a starting figure, you'd probably end up with a net overseas migration figure of around about 60,000 to 100,000 a year for that first 5 years, depending on how many people stayed and didn't leave as they are every year now. And from that figure, you would then auction off those spots to determine what the fee would be. So basically, you'd have every month. So say you'd have every month. Say you'd have, like, let's say you've got 100,000 people for the year. That's your migrant intake. Every month you might have 850 migrant spots, or 8,500 migrant spots auctioned off, and the fee that auction lands on would be the fee that those tranche of migrants pay. So basically, you've got a kind of like a cap, like an amount each month, and that cap each month would then have an auction that would determine the price for everyone who comes in that tranche. So we did estimate in 2016 for the Productivity Commission, we estimated roughly how much we thought the migration fee might be. And back in 2016, they thought it might have been 40 to 50 grand, but in 2025 money, that's around about 100 grand, adjusting for inflation. So the price would be determined by auction is the answer. Under my way of applying this policy, what I would advocate for if I was elected, the price would be set by way of auction, but that would be done periodically each month. Now, there's a comment on YouTube that I want to read out to the X space, which actually addresses my next point as well. So Red Fury says, a better problem to address is Australia's birth rate. Now, not just our immigration settings, but all of our settings will, I believe, influence and improve that birth rate. So the first thing is that if you say that the migrant intake is determined by the existing population or a percentage of the existing population for that first 5 years, then by definition, as the local birth rate improves or grows, then we have the capacity to take a few more migrants. All of our other settings and the policy settings we've put in place around prosperity, family, all of the things we've already talked about, basically help to reduce the opportunity cost of having children, which is one of the reasons why birth rates are dropping. Basically, people feel as though they can't afford to have kids, either dollar terms financially, or because they feel like they would have to basically go without other things. That is an opportunity cost. And I think that a lot of the libertarian policy settings that we're talking about would actually make it a lot easier. Like Jim Chalmers can talk all he likes about, have extra kids because the government would like you to. But in reality, if you're struggling to put food on the table, pay your mortgage, and pay for petrol, you're not going to be bringing another child into the world, or very, very few people will. So actually enhancing the prosperity of the existing society is the best way to boost the domestic population. So it's a great question, and I think that our policy settings actually do address that as well, both by making the migrant intake related to the existing population, so you're not just going to have this huge spike compared to the existing population, but also by all of our policy settings making Australia a more prosperous and a less costly in dollar terms and opportunity costs place to have kids.
Well, Jordan, I'm sure you've touched on many of them already, but let's break it down and go through the 6 points. Of course, point number 1 is to phase out the bureaucratic quota system. I'll touch a little bit again, just of course, briefly, remind us why maybe this is a bad idea to have a quota system for immigration.
Well, quotas in immigration fail for the reason quotas in every area of policy fail. It's because it's the government guessing, not based on any special knowledge, not based on any special insight or wisdom, but the government guessing because the government says it knows best. And often these decisions are made not consulting with industry. They're often taking into account things that really aren't relevant. And they're often acting for purposes that are really pretty nefarious. Like, the government is explicitly essentially trying to keep Australia out of a recession. It's trying to cook the books. So the bureaucratic quota system costs too much, doesn't work, gets the wrong mix and the wrong number of immigrants because the government's just guessing. And it also has the effect of being very expensive. So we have to pay this huge immigration department because every immigration review officer is spending all this time assessing and determining on a points basis and, more or less arbitrarily choosing who gets in and who doesn't. Whereas under our system, we can fire all those public servants, basically. Their only job is to run checks to make sure that somebody is eligible to migrate and then check whether the money's hit the government bank account. That's it. And so that will allow us to significantly reduce the bureaucracy.
Point number 2 is to implement an immigration fee system. And you spoke a moment ago about an estimate of what that fee may be. But how does this help improve the quality of immigrants who are migrating to Australia?
So by fixing the incentives, and we'll come to those a little bit more in the next part of this policy as well, because we're not just talking about the migration system itself in terms of who comes in, but we're also talking about the incentives of like what the experience for migrants is when they get here, how easy it is to get citizenship, what benefits citizenship entitles you to, and what benefits should be reserved only for citizens. So basically, the introduction of a migration fee will improve the composition of our intake by making sure that migration is better matched to the genuine skilled migration needs of business, and to make sure that the migrants who come are people who are well-resourced, independent, entrepreneurial individuals who are prepared and able to fend for themselves and to make a positive contribution to the existing society. And to make sure that they are basically paying the cost of their impact on public infrastructure and services as well upfront, rather than having to do that by tax over time.
Point number 3 is that the Libertarian Party will limit short-term visas to a maximum of 5 years. Jordan, why is this so important? Where is it going wrong at the moment?
Well, this is critical because we know that many people who end up obtaining permanent residency do so via a pathway of most commonly student visas, sometimes uncommonly tourist or temporary working visas, but quite often student visas will be obtained, they'll be linked together, there'll be multiple courses undertaken to maintain a student visa, and then over time, a permanent residency pathway will be created from that. That's not the purpose of these visas, and it shouldn't be possible to simply bypass the migration fee by coming in on a short-term non-residential visa and then artificially trying to game that system. And, I was talking to an Indian entrepreneur the other day who lives in Sydney, and he was saying that there's so much absenteeism from from full fee-paying university spots. There's so many people who are signing up to university degrees and then working when they get here illegally. And it's basically a system that's being rorted. So we need to close that loophole and make sure that we're limiting the extent to which we can have people come and stay beyond the intention of these short-term visas.
Point 4 is that the Libertarian Party will restrict access to citizenship. Jordan, why is Australian citizenship so important and special to us, and why should it be kept something that is so important and special and valued as well?
So at the moment, our citizenship is given away far too readily. We're basically giving away the keys to the kingdom with very little time comparatively. And we argue that citizenship should be restricted to people who have lived in Australia for at least 10 years, who basically have demonstrated their ability to remain self-sufficient, because if we restrict, as point 5 says, if we restrict welfare to citizens only, then anyone who becomes a citizen, by definition, will not have had welfare in the preceding 10 years. So anyone who toughs it out and hangs around and stays in Australia and makes a life for themselves and wants to become a citizen has proven already by the passage of time that they haven't committed criminal offences, because we certainly believe that people who come here and commit criminal offences while they're permanent residents before their citizenships, before they can apply for citizenship, that they should be deported. Like, we shouldn't be allowing people to stay if they come here to, purportedly create a better life for themselves and to benefit the existing society, and then they show that they're people who are not going to contribute to the existing society. And I don't say that from a mean-spirited, attributive way. I myself have, a criminal record. I struggled with drugs and alcohol in my 20s, but I would expect fully that if I had struggled with those things in America or in Europe, I would not be living in America or Europe right now. I'd be back here in Australia, because they wouldn't really be interested in investing in the project of Jordan overseas, they would be sending me back here to do the rehabilitation back here. So we really need a longer period of time to observe people and make sure that they are deserving of citizenship, and that we don't give that away too freely, that we are basically making sure that citizenship is the end of a journey that has meaning.
And Jordan, of course, you touched on point 5, which is to restrict welfare to citizens only. But point 6 is to avoid entangling alliances with global bodies. Tell us a little bit about what that means, maybe what's happening at the moment. And many people might not realize why this is a big deal.
Yeah, I did just want to quickly on point 5 make the point that if we were to implement a system like this, it wouldn't be grandfathered backwards. We'd be saying for new arrivals, they would be under this new regime where they wouldn't be able to access certain things. You'll notice Medicare isn't in there. Medicare should be available after a 2 or 3 year period, because that's kind of like more of a living thing. That's not as much of a welfare thing, but certainly unemployment benefits, social housing, and pensions should be reserved for citizens alone. So basically, for number 6, we are currently signed up to many treaties and many global organizations that essentially tell us how we have to deal with refugees. The whole problem with unauthorized arrivals by boat and all the different ways and means the government has tried over the years to deal with that problem all really flow from our international commitments, which we really shouldn't have. If Australia is going to be compassionate and show, a desire to help others, then that should be done through private philanthropy. It shouldn't be that the government and taxpayers are socialising this kind of charity. So basically, we would be withdrawing from these conventions. We'd be replacing these things. It could be that Australia ends up with a greater refugee intake because people might say, this is the most important thing to me. We're going to join groups and have church groups and things like that, pay these migration fees to bring people over and resettle them here. We're going to support them in the community. Like that is an outcome that could happen, but it won't happen on the taxpayer's dollar, and it won't happen in a way that's disruptive to Australian society. Taking 1,000 people from a specific war zone at a specific period of time in a period of great tension has already proven to be a bad idea, and I think we're going to be reaping the consequences of that decision for some time to come.
Thank you. And of course, those are the Libertarian policies on immigration. We are going to read out a few questions in the comments section. Of course, you can comment on YouTube, you can comment on Facebook, and you can comment on Twitter on the post in the nest. Jordan, before I go to some of the questions and comments on immigration, is there anything you would like to conclude with that maybe you didn't cover in your preamble or the 6 topics that we brought up?
No, I think that our policy is, all I'll finish on is that I think our policy is a very smart approach that gets the incentives right and knows that the outcomes will flow from the incentives. I think our policy is also a policy that we shouldn't forget will have significant impact on helping us downpay debt. So we're in a debt hole. We need revenue, and we don't want to impose taxes on the existing society. We want to lower the burden on them. One of the things that Australia can sell, essentially, that is a resource, is access to our country and permanent residency in our country. And we should be treating that as a valuable commodity because it is. It's scarce. People want to come and live here. It's a great country. Our policy will have the effect of slowing migration and introducing incentives that will result in more benefit to the existing society. And I also think that it's a policy that is creative and might well be something that we could persuade and agitate for certainly a Liberal government potentially to adopt, because they might be in a position where they're really trying to take action and show that they are listening to the concerns of people. At the moment, they've released a policy which is pretty much a nothing policy. They've really been very timid in this space, but they're going to want to do budget repair, and they might well consider an option like this realistically. Like realistically, no coalition government, no Labor government is ever going to consider net zero migration. Whether that's right or wrong, whether you agree with that or disagree with that, they may well consider the kind of solution we're talking about, which will improve the long-term incentives.
Jordan, a question on immigration. Finn Holman asks on Twitter, why bother with the complexity of a migration fee when reducing the intake directly would have the same or a better impact? What's to stop companies just taking the migration fee out of the new arrival's salary, making it cheaper than hiring local?
Well, I don't think it would be, because essentially the company is in a position where it can sponsor somebody to come and pay the migration fee, certainly. And you may well have a situation where I could see Australian companies or overseas companies entering into loan agreements with prospective migrants. So basically, people might say, look, I really want to migrate to Australia. I think I've got a good chance of making it there, and I feel like I can hit the ground running and make a go of it. Based on the strength of my application to you, the loan company, will you loan me the money to pay the migration fee, and then I'll pay it back out of my salary once I'm working in Australia, sort of like a fee help, but for migration. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's infinitely better. The government still gets the benefit, and we, the taxpayers, get the benefit of that migration fee. The company or the business that's advancing that loan is taking a risk, so they're going to vet people that they advance that loan to. It's not going to be something that the government provides. It's going to be something that private commercial banks or entities provide, but businesses provide. Businesses aren't going to invest in bringing someone over to fill a vacancy or a role here in Australia if they're going to have paid that migration fee up front, because it's not a fee that gets spread out over the time in terms of when it gets paid to the government. It's paid up front. You would need to be pretty sure that someone was going to deliver value to your business and that they would stay with you if you were going to pay that up front. You're really you're giving businesses skin in the game. So I actually think it's superior in every way. Whatever the number is, if you just change the net overseas migration, if you just change the migration intake, you're changing nothing about the incentives. You're changing nothing about the kind of people who are going to come. All you're doing is kicking the problem down the road, and you're potentially leaving Australia with much worse outcomes. So I don't agree that it is superior. And I think there are significant advantages from our policy, especially taken in context and taken together with the changes to citizenship and the changes to welfare that we propose. I think our policy is superior to that in every way. And it's simpler.
Thank you.
So the idea that it's simpler to just, like, can you imagine the amount of time and the amount of waste and the amount of government bureaucracy that you would have if they had to decide on a fifth of the number they bring in now, but it was still government bureaucrats in charge. Like, there's no reason to think that it would be done any more effectively or any less of a disaster than what it is now.
Thank you, Jordan. And of course, that is the Libertarian immigration policy under the family section of the policies in the link in the nest.
Preston, just before we go on, I've just got a question. Exiled Aussie might have only just joined us, so they might not have heard the answer I gave before on YouTube. So I'll just read their question out. They just said, how much would the fee be and what kind of numbers would be appropriate? So Exiled Aussie, we talked a little bit ago that you might have missed. We talked about there being a couple of options for setting a migration fee. One, that the government just sets it. I think that's not the right call, because I think the bad faith government will just set the fee like low if they want a high immigration intake, and they'll sort of avoid the real benefits of the system we're proposing. What I would propose, if I was in a position where I was, like sitting across from Peter Dutton or his team or whatever, and they say, look, we really want to get this bill through that we want, you can get what you want on immigration, what do you need? We would say that the best way to set the fee would be to set a desired intake initially for a 5-year period and have that be reviewed by the Productivity Commission after that 5 years. And I would say, me as the candidate, if I were implementing our policy, I would say that the best way to set the fee would be to auction off the spots that are available based on that desired intake, which I think should be around that 1% of the existing population less outflows. So you'd probably end up with a net overseas migration number of around 60,000 to 100,000 if that metric was adopted. And those places that you had, that 60,000 to 100,000 each year for that 5 years, you would auction those off every month for 12 months. You would basically have a tranche of available spots. You would put those spots up for auction, and the highest bidder at auction would set the price for the entire tranche. So it's important to remember that itself, even if you have a desired intake where you say, okay, this is the number of people we're prepared to accept, it might be that under a migration fee set by desired intake set by auction, you might have the auction price set at a price that people might not want to pay, that it might be quite high. So you're only going to get the 2,000 in that month who want to pay that quite high price because there's a big demand from industry or from whatever else. So you are going to have natural market dynamics where when demand is high, people will be prepared, business will be prepared to pay more for the migration fee by auction. So therefore that will have an effect on the overall number of people who come that month. They might say, look, it's a bit pricey for me. I'm going to wait until the migration fee might be less next month, the month after, and try then. So even though we're nominating a desired intake for the purposes of setting the price by auction, there's nothing to say that that intake has to be filled. And if there's not enough people who are prepared to pay that price, it won't be. So you have that natural kind of market flow as well. So thanks for joining Exiled Aussie. I hope I answered your question. And if you want to go through and look at the rest of the policies and the discussion we've had earlier, you're welcome to do that on recording.
Now, we've spoken about prosperity, we've spoken about family. We're going to move into freedom. And of course, we've got 3 more topics to cover. And then we're going to open up the room for a little while for some questions. Keeping in mind, we have to appreciate Jordan giving us a lot of his time tonight to talk us through the Libertarian policy, especially since he has been out all day at Australia Day celebrations. So, Jordan, let's start under the freedom banner. Let's start on free speech. And the first point in this is that the Libertarian Party will enshrine free speech in the Constitution. Tell us a little bit about why this is so important for Australians, and maybe a little bit about the process of how that can be achieved as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we say that our first order of business in terms of constitutional reform. So, like in general, I'm someone who, as I said, I'm very interested in constitutional law. I think that constitutional reform should only be proposed to the minimum extent necessary. But free speech is a different kind of question because with free speech, because our constitution really is silent on it, we've had a situation where the High Court has more or less kind of interpreted the vibe of the Constitution, which is a very dangerous thing to do, to create this implied freedom of political communication. So the High Court has kind of basically massaged the Constitution into giving us some protections for free speech because it recognises the importance of it from a policy point of view, and that you need some free speech to guarantee the continuation of a representative and democratic form of government as we have in our Constitution. So in this instance, we're actually just updating the Constitution so that the High Court doesn't have to do these gymnastics to try to imply a right that should be explicit. So in this case, I actually support this constitutional amendment reform to enshrine free speech, to make sure that government is limited and cannot actually introduce legislation for whatever reason, no matter how well-intentioned, to limit the free speech of Australians. And we would say that should be modelled on the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So I'm really excited about that. A lot of people have been asking us, do we support a constitutional right to free speech? We absolutely do. And I think it's actually quite achievable. I think that most Australians would like to see that, and it actually would prevent the situation we've got now where the High Court's kind of winging it and trying to, imply something that isn't really there.
Point number 2 is that the Libertarian Party will abolish Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. Jordan, what is the Racial Discrimination Act? Is it being appropriately used? Is it being misused? And should we, of course, why is it a good idea to get rid of it?
Yeah, so 18C is something we've opposed for a long time. We long warned that it would be used the way it has been used against Andrew Bolt and now Pauline Hanson. So Pauline Hanson is obviously my political competition. Like we're competing at the federal election. Warren Pickering from One Nation and I are both running for the same Senate spot. But no Australian should face the kind of High Court litigation that Pauline Hanson has for what she said. What she said was clearly expressing a view based on the actions of the person involved. And I think it was pretty reasonable that she said it. And I don't think she should have been prevented from saying it or have this chilling effect that we have now from 18C. And I think 18C, unfortunately, is an example of what anti-vilification laws and social cohesion laws being passed now will end up being used to do, which is to muzzle opponents. So, we absolutely support the removal of 18C. The coalition used to support that removal. Tony Abbott got elected promising to repeal it, and he never did, and it's unfinished business.
Point 3, Jordan, is that the Libertarian Party will oppose misinformation and disinformation legislation. Now, we've already seen in 2024 the Libertarian Party hold rallies against this kind of legislation. And it's very good to hear that the Libertarian Party, as an official policy, will continue to oppose this. Did you have any comment on that?
So obviously a big concern to a lot of people was that the coalition originally proposed that legislation that was defeated, and they never ruled out explicitly introducing their own kind of misinformation and e-safety legislation or giving the e-safety commission new powers. I know that I'm a broken record when I say this, but I always want to put it on the record reminding people. Peter Dutton said Julie Inman Grant is one of the finest public servants in Canberra. He loves her. He created the e-safety commission. They're always quick to take credit for it. And we saw with the age verification, bill, the coalition are completely happy to be hypocritical on free speech. So the e-safety commission needs to be abolished. It can't be fixed. It can't be made good. It needs to go.
Leading on to point 4, we heard a very similar policy a little bit earlier in regards to counselling and psychologists. But point 4 is to protect the rights of medical practitioners to advise freely. Jordan, do we see the same kind of problem where they are limited in their scope of what they are allowed to say due to regulatory bodies, the government interfering?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing with examples like Dr. Hobart and other examples that have come up recently in Queensland and others, a lot of medical professionals really did want to speak out during COVID, but they were censored and silenced by their medical body, their head medical body, and by their peers and colleagues. So, we really believe in conscientious objection. We believe that professionals, whether it be legal professionals, medical professionals, they should be free to advise their patients. And, they really should be able to do so without fear of professional discipline or regulatory consequences as well.
Now, whether you are listening on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, point 5 is very important to all of us. Point 5 is that the Libertarian Party will stop censorship of social media platforms. Talk a little bit about the censorship that's been happening and the battles that the government is facing against private companies, and why that is not on under a libertarian government, Jordan.
So we think that the best people to decide what children should be accessing online and what they should or shouldn't be able to do is their parents. We shouldn't have to co-parent with the government, and libertarians don't need to consult a party room or a focus group to decide what they believe about this issue. We're committed, no ifs, buts, or maybes, to repealing the age verification laws, which in the end will stop a lot more 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds from accessing social media than kids under 16.
And last but not least, under free speech, under the libertarian free speech policies, is to defund and privatize the ABC and SBS. Jordan, why should the ABC and SBS not be government funded? Why should they be privatized?
Well, if there's genuinely a demand and a need for them, then if they were sold to the highest bidder or moved onto a subscription footing where people could opt in to pay for them and they can work and do whatever they want within that funding, like it's similar with the BBC model, where people pay a subscription if they choose the BBC, and they have to basically design content that is going to get them subscribers. So it basically turns them into a private enterprise. Look, I don't think there's a big risk of me getting airtime on the ABC during this federal election campaign, but if they do give me airtime, I'm going to be telling them to their face that they should be defunded. So it's probably going to be a once-off. But it would be spectacular if that was able to happen on live with the ABC. So the ABC and the SBS are enemies of the rule of law and of Australian citizens. And I can't put it any more strongly than that. They absolutely deserve to find whatever success, limited as it might be, that they would find in the private sector.
And of course, those are the libertarian policies on free speech. Now, I'm not seeing any comments on Twitter for those. Any questions just yet? Of course, very soon we've got 2 more topics to cover, and then we will be inviting some people to join the conversation. But since there are, as of yet, no comments, let's move on to privacy. Jordan, the Libertarian policies on privacy. Point one, the Libertarian Party will abolish digital ID laws. And I think that's been a very big issue for many people running social media campaigns over Twitter and I'm sure other platforms over the last 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one area where the coalition, I think, have been very disingenuous and they've been very dishonest about their intentions. There was all this talk that they were going to pass amendments to make the age verification legislation not able to use digital ID. And in the end, the amendments they got didn't do that. What they said was that digital ID was fine as long as an alternative method of identification was provided. And that's where they think that's clever. They think that they can kind of weasel words, say that they oppose digital ID when all they're doing is saying that there's this guarantee where as long as they're providing some other mechanism other than digital ID, that somehow doesn't mean it's compulsory. And we just don't accept that. The Digital ID Act should be repealed. If private companies want to implement a kind of digital ID that consumers agree to through contract, great. But there's no reason the government needs to know more about you than you know about the government.
Now, point two, under the libertarian privacy policies, the Libertarian Party will end social media segregation. Jordan, what is meant by this and why is it so important? I'll just check in. I think
Sorry, my
Jordan's
apologies. I
microphone may
was
be
I was
muted.
talking to myself on mute then for a second. My apologies for that. Yeah, so absolutely, the right of an individual to use social media. So this, I've strayed into this when I was talking about the digital identity laws and the misinformation, disinformation laws earlier. But this really basically says that the internet shouldn't be restricted. There shouldn't be barriers to entry, whether it be age or ID or whatever else. I just think that has no place in modern society, and we're seeing it shift away in the rest of the world, in the US in particular. And I think that the writing's on the wall in that regard.
Point number three, the Libertarian Party will abolish the office of the e-safety commissioner. I know this is a big one for many of us. And Jordan, you mentioned before that the e-safety commissioner can never be good. Why can an e-safety commissioner never be good?
Because you're giving an unelected bureaucrat, a government official, a remit, and you're telling them that there's a problem they have to solve. So the classic government response to that is that they're going to find more of the problem to solve. They're never going to just accept their limited remit. They're never going to do anything other than find more work for themselves to do, find more budget, grow into different areas. And they are just doing what it is in the nature of government to do. And there's really no way around that. And we don't think there's any reason they need to exist at all.
The next point, of course, is point number four, which is that the Libertarian Party will abolish mass surveillance laws. Jordan, tell us a little bit about what's happening at the moment, what's happening in regards to mass surveillance, and of course, why it's so important that Australians have that right to privacy.
Well, as I said before, we say that the government should know less about you than you know about the government. And we're very, very concerned about the rise of mass surveillance at a council level, at a state government level, at a federal level. We really think that the right to privacy, particularly in public, has been significantly eroded. And if you think about it, we've had these recent attacks on businesses in Sydney and Melbourne, on places of worship. The government can read a license plate from outer space, but apparently when it comes to actually protecting your personal and property rights, they can't find someone who's committed an offence. So clearly, all this mass surveillance is directed to other ends than actually protecting you and legitimate criminal investigation purposes. So we say that there's no excuse and there's no justification for the continued growth of the surveillance state, and we'd seek to roll it back.
And of course, another form of our privacy is our metadata, which leads to point number five, which is the Libertarian Party will stop the collection of metadata. Jordan, is this happening regularly? I know it's something that many people might not even realize is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And the use of metadata to identify people using using people using encrypted apps, accessing people's phones, all this sort of thing. It really is atrocious, and the use of metadata by law enforcement authorities, in particular, is really something that needs to be curbed.
And last but not least, under the libertarian privacy policies, is that the Libertarian Party will preserve the use of cash. Now, I know I was at the shops the other day and they had a sign saying "EFTPOS only," and I think this is a really important thing that matters to a lot of people. Jordan, tell us a little bit about preserving the use of cash.
So our policy is that cash should be available and people should be free to use cash. We don't think cash should be mandated. So we don't think that the government should be saying businesses have to accept cash, but cash as legal tender should be preserved, and shouldn't be abolished. Like, what's happening in this space is that the government is trying to do what it does with everything, where it creates policy settings that make something so difficult to continue to do that the continued use of something declines. And coal's a great example in the energy space, where the government is fond of saying, oh, coal's lost its social license. Well, another way of putting that is to say that you destroyed their social license. And I and libertarians are very concerned that government is embarked on the process of destroying the social license of cash. Now, last weekend, I was at the Bendigo Centre State Swap Meet, which was an amazing event. It was terrific. And I looked around the whole place and I don't think I saw a single EFTPOS card. And that kind of swap meet where small businesses and traders are engaging in trade, they probably aren't wanting to pay GST and do reporting and all that sort of thing on their interactions, and they should be free to do that. There's no reason why government should be basically putting cash out of business.
Now, Jordan, we have a question on the privacy policies. Phase 666 asks on Twitter, do you believe that foreign governments should control media companies that can be used to control what information is accepted, such as a certain country suppressing lab leaks on TikTok? The same risk arises with privatizing the ABC if an adversarial government buys it.
Yeah, but I think the same thing holds true in reverse, right? Where you have private companies who were being, you had both public and private media companies like Twitter before Elon Musk bought it, being threatened by not just Chinese governments, but American governments. Like, whether it's public or private, public almost ensures censorship. The idea that public communications would somehow be more immune or less susceptible to government influence. Like, all you need to do is look at the ABC and they're reporting on anything, any topic. Their take is always atrocious. So I really think that's not the argument you think it is. I think that the idea that the CCP would be the only government that would seek to manipulate social media to try to sell their agenda or push a particular narrative. I think that competition, like Rumble, is a great example of a company that basically told misinformation, disinformation censors to take a long walk off a short pier. And I think that competition in that marketplace is the best solution. Making sure that you have more companies offering services that basically commit to a pro free speech platform. I just don't accept that foreign corporations somehow are less reliable or trustworthy. Like I think X, which is owned by Elon Musk, I'm coming to you now from my beautiful new Starlink setup. I am thrilled to be giving Elon my money instead of the government, and the product is excellent. And I would much, much rather Elon Musk, a foreign billionaire, own a communications platform that I trust than my own government every day of the week.
Thank you. And of course, that is the libertarian privacy policies. Of course, if you want to follow along and read them for yourself, they are in the link above our names on Twitter. You can click on the link in that post. Now, let's move on to the very final topic for tonight and the very final policy, which is foreign affairs. Jordan, let's start off on point one, which is that the Libertarian Party will focus on national defense. Why is this so important?
So at the moment, we have a bloated military spend that is not delivering real security for Australia and Australia's interests. We've got a military, and I know a little bit about this because my first job was in the army, and they were in the process then of undertaking what they called like alignment. For example, they were using ammunition that was interchangeable with American troops to make sure that they could work interchangeably with Americans. So our whole military setup is focused on force projection and coalition assistance to America. And that's no good to us if we ever have to defend our island country on our own. And it may well be that at a certain point in the future, we will have to defend our island country on our own. And if our whole military doctrine and our whole military procurement strategy is focused on supporting America on global force projection overseas in desert countries in the Middle East, when we are forced to fight in Australian bush in our own land, or if we're engaged in a conflict in our immediate region, Indonesia is a swampy area of littorals, which is like little islands. At the moment, we're not designed to operate in the environment we actually should be concerned with. And that's done at the cost of the taxpayers, huge cost. Like AUKUS is a great example of this, where we're buying nuclear attack submarines. Like, to what end? That's not a defensive posture. That's an overpriced, off-the-shelf, ridiculous expense that is equal parts a dick measuring contest and some sort of like national pride endeavor, and designed to work in with American foreign policy interests and defense interests. Australia has many advantages as an island nation. We should have a world-class defense force, and defense force being the operative word. And we believe that the ADF should not be deployed to foreign conflicts unless Australia's interests are directly threatened. And I think that the definition of Australia's interests when it comes to military intervention has been allowed to grow far too broad and is used very cynically and manipulated by politicians who want to, for their own reasons, basically. I was finished with my answer, but I just saw a fantastic comment on YouTube from DML where they say AUKUS is just a way for USA to revenue raise billions from Australian taxpayers. I could not have put it better myself. That is an amazing. I'm going to leave that up on the screen for a little bit. That's exactly right. That's how I feel.
Point number 2 is that the Libertarian Party will limit ADF overseas deployments. And I'm sure many in the ADF will be happy to hear that they are not being separated from their families for things that have nothing to do with our country. Jordan, is that right?
I mean, all you have to do is look at the recent debacle in Afghanistan, and regardless of what happened over there and what the conduct was of the people there, they should never have been there in the first place doing what they were doing. We had no business being there, and we were sending our young men and women with inadequate leadership that permitted whatever it is that happened over there to occur. And if it sounds like I'm a bit passionate about this and a bit angry about it, I am, because I think if you focus on Ben Roberts-Smith or anyone else that was alleged of doing wrongdoing over there, that's not just a failure on their part. That's a failure on their leaders' part, on their captains, on their unit commanders, all that sort of thing. People who were aware of things like that going on and said or did nothing and didn't show leadership. That's on them, and it's on the higher command for even allowing them to be in those environments in the first place. Another point that threads through both of these two is that it's not even the Libertarian policy to cut defense spending. If we kept our defense spending the exact same as what it is now in dollar terms, we would have a world-class defense force. But at the moment, we're trying to be all things to all people, and we're trying to be the US deputy sheriff in the region, and it's to our great detriment. Now, there may be a time in the future where there is another World War II, where there is a genuine, and I say this as someone who is descended from German immigrants who came here after World War II, like, the Nazi regime was a legitimate threat to global peace and was actively, aggressively expanding and attacking foreign nations. That has not happened since World War II, and no foreign conflict we've been involved in since World War II has been a genuine, justified self-defense.
Of course, point 3 and the penultimate point of all of the statements is that the Libertarian Party will reassert national sovereignty. Jordan, along very similar lines, tell us about that.
So I think that until Australian politicians start going themselves to foreign conflicts, or until they start sending their children, we have a responsibility to make sure that the the blood and the best of Australia's youth never again gets squandered on foreign shores. And I think that there's a real risk of that happening if nothing changes. Australia has an amazing opportunity to show leadership and to be a uniquely placed negotiator, diplomat, trusted mediator in the region. That is being undermined by our perceived toadying and deputizing to American interests. We shouldn't be in situations where we have no skin in the game, and we're actually diminishing our value to America as a neutral, trusted friend who can intervene and intercede in the region without actually being bound to follow them blindly.
And finally, Jordan, the Libertarian Party will relinquish membership in international bodies. Tell us some of the international bodies that the Libertarian Party will relinquish membership for.
So
just check in with Jordan.
No, that's okay. Sorry, I'm back. So the UN Human Rights Commission, the UN Refugee Treaty as well, the World Health Organization. I mean, we've already seen Donald Trump pull out of the World Health Organization. I think Australia should absolutely follow. These organizations are organizations that the left of politics in particular use to seek to limit what Australian governments can do that's in the best interest of the Australian people. They say, oh, no, this is international law. Like, we've made these commitments, as though that somehow should bind or limit what is good for taxpayers. So we should certainly not seek membership in any further international bodies of this nature, and we should be withdrawing from organisations that are not in Australia's best interest as well.
Thank you. And those are the Libertarian foreign affairs policy. Of course, tonight we've spoken about prosperity, family, and freedom. We've covered policies on the economy, money, on energy. We've covered policies on education, women and children, and immigration. We've also covered policies on free speech, privacy, and foreign affairs. Now, of course, for a very short time, just because we are on a time constraint, we are going to open up the conversation for anyone on Twitter who would like to join and ask a question. While that's happening, Jordan, while maybe some people are coming up with a question and requesting to speak, of course, we're also live on YouTube and Facebook. Did you have maybe a final statement on the policy platform and what you're excited about, and what can Australians maybe take from this into the election?
Just two quick things. There's two really great comments on YouTube that I wanted to address. So Exiled Aussie says, what about foreign aid? So I'm a little bit surprised that our foreign aid kind of stance didn't make it into the policy document, because I think it would have fitted in really well in this section. But certainly there are massive sections of foreign aid that need to be severely reviewed. A lot of Australians would be shocked to learn that we are not just spending money, supporting in disaster relief and aid and all this sort of thing. We're actually spending money on vaccine rollouts in Africa. We're spending money on LGBTIQ plus initiatives in the region. All this sort of crazy stuff, which quite frankly is obscene and offensive to Australians who are struggling. So the government's saying, you have to do it hard, you have to tighten your belt, at the same time as they're spending all this bizarre, like, prestige project money on all manner of random things. So I think the foreign aid spend should absolutely be thoroughly reviewed. And I really think it should be far, far less than what it is. Handsome Monkey King also says, personally, I support Ukraine's resistance and self-determinism. Wouldn't force anyone else to support them, though. That is exactly the right position. I believe that any Australian should feel free to be able to pick up a gun, go to the Ukraine, join an international brigade and fight on the front line. They shouldn't expect the Australian taxpayer to bail them out if they do. But I think it's everyone's right to support whatever cause that they want, including by solidarity in taking up arms. Incidentally, the foreign fighter laws that got passed to prevent Australians from going and doing that for ISIS don't prevent them from doing it from the Ukraine, because we recognise the Ukrainian government. So I totally agree with you. I personally wish the Ukraine the best, and I think they are the victim of unwarranted aggression. But I don't think that involving ourselves in a border conflict and potentially escalating it into a world war is the appropriate response to do with Australian taxpayers' money and essentially by coercion. So I totally agree with you, Handsome Monkey King. I am much in the same boat. In
Now,
general,
of
when it
course,
comes to the policy document, I think that I just firstly want to recognise and acknowledge the immense amount of hard work that has gone into developing this. I've seen a lot of it firsthand. I know there's been a lot of tireless effort behind the scenes. And look, it could be that there are some of you listening who, whether it's on immigration or whatever other policy, you might feel as though it didn't go as far as you wanted. You might feel as though you prefer a stronger measure. But what I would invite you to do is to consider our policies as a whole, to consider our principles, and not just that, to consider our work ethic and our adherence to our principles and our unity as a party. Everyone is libertarian on one or two issues, and we need a new solution to the problems Australia is facing. We can't have more of the same. One Nation has had its couple of decades in the sun, has had its opportunity to try to really establish a beachhead and grow a genuine grassroots resistance to the Uni Party. They haven't done that, and I don't think they will do that. And I think if they survive through this election, I think that they'll be doing well to survive through to 2028 when Pauline Hanson retires. So we need to invest in the reform, into the Trump movement of the next 10 to 15 years now, and that is the Libertarian Party. And some of you have been privy to the campaign we've been running. You've seen and had the opportunity to observe over a long period of time, nearly 8 months, the amount of work, energy, and tenacity I've put into the campaign. If I'm elected to the Senate, the Sunday following the federal election is day one of the 2028 federal election campaign. So I really implore you all to consider in its totality the libertarian position and the libertarian policy stance, and to consider giving us your first preference vote.
Thank you, Jordan. Now we're going to start having some people up to ask some questions. I will ask, just because we are on a limited time, that you ask your full question at the start, and Jordan, of course, will answer it. But we may not have time for any back and forth. But of course, Jordan does these spaces on a weekly basis. So if you want to have more of a conversation with him, you can follow him and make sure you join his spaces on Fridays.
I also
Now,
want to say
Jordan,
too that I'm going to be going through some of these policy areas and posting more about them on X. I'm not going to be assuming that everyone came to this or listened to the whole thing. I'm going to be engaging and interacting with these policy areas from now until the federal election. That's my job. That's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm always available for a chat. If you guys want to send me a DM, I'm always happy to do that as well. So.
Perfect. And so you're welcome to send a speaker request on the bottom left-hand corner. But first up, we have MDT Lion. MDT Lion, did you have a question for Jordan?
Yeah, I did, Jordan. I came along today, so well done in St Kilda today. I saw that was the third of your appearances today, so was impressed by what you had to say there, albeit quite short. I only caught the end of your chat tonight, so I'll go through your policies in detail. My question's more about the future, though. If I look at sort of what Javier Milei is doing in Argentina, and now Trump is sort of starting to do in the US, is 2028 going to be too late for Australia to be able to sort of kick into what we need to get into the right mode of what these countries are doing? Because I appreciate we've only got a couple of months until the next election, but feels to me like 4 years is going to be a long time to wait for the Conservative forces to join forces. So what can we do over the next 4 years, I suppose, leading up to 2028, so that Australia's not left too far behind?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for your words of encouragement. I loved the video you got. You actually got better video than the person I was getting to record it. The shadows stuffed up my video, so I'm going to have to reach out to you and see if I can get your video, because I got great audio with my mic, but my video was really bad. So we might combine our forces and get a good video out there. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for your support and your engagement with the campaign. I've seen you on Spaces and on social media engage a lot as well. I think your question is a really good one, and it's something that I spend a lot of my time thinking about. I've got to focus on what's in front of me first to get elected. But the reason I want to get elected is not because I want to sit in the Senate for 6 years and say base shit and, feel good about myself. If I wanted to do that, I could stay in my legal career and concentrate on raising my family and taking a narrower view of what my best interests are. The reason I'm putting my hand up, and the reason I think that the Libertarian Party is the vehicle to achieve what you and what the country desperately needs, is because we have already got the runs on the board. We have a track record of reaching out across the aisle to the other minor parties to invite them to cooperate. Now, I've spoken about that and posted about that at length on X. Former Senator Bob Day and I proposed a Senate Alliance coalition ticket that would have seen each of the parties, FON, UAP at the time, Family First, Libertarians, would have seen each of us share the #1 spot in each state and put all of our efforts and all of our vote in the Senate for each party behind that lead candidate to basically ensure that we would have doubled the representation of the minor center right in the Senate. That's what we came up with as a plan. That's what we proposed. Unfortunately, UAP had the troubles that it's still going through now when it comes to getting re-registered. And James Ashby from FON told me, look, Jordan, I like what you're suggesting. I wish you the best of luck, but FON isn't a minor party anymore. That's what he told me. And then 3 weeks later, Mark Latham and their other male MP in New South Wales left One Nation. So unfortunately, One Nation is convinced that it can just hold out on its own and become the Greens of the right. It's wrong. It's been proven to be wrong over the last 20 years. And as a result of not accepting the proposal to build a sensible, pragmatic coalition that I proposed, I fear that Malcolm Roberts may lose his seat. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that if I'm elected to the Senate, it is to serve, a term alongside Malcolm Roberts, who's done great work. But my genuine concern is that outcome, which could have been very easily avoided, will occur simply through hubris. But if I'm elected, I will be day one seeking to build that kind of Senate coalition. We don't need to work together in the Senate in terms of we don't need to be a single party. We can retain our individual identities once elected, but for the purposes of contesting elections and for the purposes of defeating the uniparty system that has been set up to try to create a gate and a wall around Canberra, we can ally together to breach that wall with a battering ram using this coalition Senate ticket without sacrificing the independent identities of each party and policies of each party. So it doesn't even require a fusion or a merging, because a lot of Australians just don't understand the differences, but there are really important differences. If I didn't think there were differences, I wouldn't be running. But I believe the Libertarians do bring something unique and do bring something valuable, as do other parties. But once we're elected, those things can all play out and people can take their measure and decide. But basically, we really are the only party who has actually proposed what you're talking about. So we have that track record. I was authorised by the federal executive at the time when I was the federal secretary to negotiate. We had a plan. We put it to other parties and they didn't want to be a part of it. And so often, or too often, when people get up, they pull the stepladder up behind them and they think that they don't need to work together anymore. And I'm here to tell you that if I'm elected, that's not going to be the way it is. I'm someone who's pragmatic. I'm a relationship builder. I'm someone who wants the outcome and is prepared to work with others to get it. So that needs to happen. So I think that even though it might sound like a self-serving thing to say, the best thing that Australians can do now to get the outcome you want in 2028, which I think is freedom-friendly lower house candidates winning lower house seats in 2028 or beyond, to do that, we need to get a libertarian voice back in the Senate, because I will use that platform ruthlessly to advance the agenda to where it needs to be, because we don't have enough time to waste another 3 years. And unfortunately, I look at Ralph Babbitt's efforts over the last 3 years and I see them as a waste, because he hasn't been able to meaningfully achieve anything other than saying some occasionally cool shit. And I think that's disappointing. So, that's. I hope that answers your question. And I think we need to be aiming for lower house representation in 2028.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jordan. I completely agree with everything you said. I'm just impatient and want more before then, and even by the Senate, I want more from 2028 onwards than what you're suggesting. But from everything I've heard from you and Craig and John and others in the Libertarian Party, my view is that that's what Australia needs. So fully behind you, mate.
Thank you, MDT Lion. Jordan D on Twitter asks, would the Libertarians consider a 51 to 49% of government to commercial ownership of nuclear power to make it a split between being efficient and also making income at the same time?
So what I would support and what the Libertarian Party would support is a ownership, so essentially there might be a case for public-private partnership in the startup phase, so clearing the regulatory hurdles, and in the initial startup capital investment. So I've spoken with Jim Wilmot, who's our lead Senate candidate from Queensland, and he's really brought me around to the idea that there could be a revenue neutral, non-ownership solution where government could help nuclear energy clear those initial hurdles and get set up and then exit. So sort of like when you build a toll road, you know, the government gets repaid in the first couple of years or whatever for their investment, and then the tollway takes over operation of that. I don't believe in the long term the government should be in the business of the energy business. I don't think that, you know, you're saying efficiency versus good outcomes for the people. I don't think they're different things. And I think government involvement inevitably goes horribly wrong no matter how good the intentions are. So I think that in the long run, nuclear energy should be privately run and privately administered. But I think there could be a role for government on a revenue neutral basis with a non-ownership scenario where government assists and then gets out of the way.
Thank you. Now, of course, we're on Twitter Spaces where people can join the conversation and engage with Jordan. Of course, if you're listening on YouTube or Facebook, you may hear different voices. That is people coming up to ask Jordan's question. On that note, I want to say hello to Tyrannical Times and ask if he has a question for Jordan about the policy. I'll just check in with Tyrannical Times one last time. And of course, if you do have a question, request to speak on the bottom left-hand corner. Tyrannical Times, did you have a question for Jordan about the policy?
Yes, and I'm a female, not a male. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm not offended. Okay, so I've got a long-standing interest in vaccination policy. I'd probably regard myself as one of the experts in Australia on all of the different vaccine laws in operation across the different states in Australia and federally. In 2015, the Liberal Party introduced a vaccination requirement for eligibility to childcare subsidy and a small portion of family tax benefit. Now, whilst I understand that it's probably libertarian policy not to subsidise childcare, a position I possibly agree with. I haven't really given it all that much thought, but yeah. So even though the Libertarian Party would probably prefer if there's no childcare subsidies at all, the fact of the matter is there is currently childcare subsidies, very significant. I mean, a person on full childcare subsidy can get up to like $30,000 a year. Last time I looked, it was around 26, 27 maximum. So it's significant subsidy. It's not a minor subsidy. So as you probably know, the effect of...
I think I know where you're going with this, Tyrannical, but I'll let you finish the question.
Yeah, I won't be long. So obviously the effect of that massive subsidy, as you could appreciate, massively distorts the childcare market. So the effect of the no jab, no pay law, which is what that law was dubbed, in fact, the amendment was actually called no jab, no pay. The effect of that on parents who choose not to vaccinate their children is significant. Particularly the lower your income goes, the more it becomes a no jab, no job policy, because you cannot afford to pay the subsidies because it's a heavily subsidised market. So the prices of childcare is artificially high, right? So yeah, it's effectively like a no jab, no job policy, similar to what we experienced during COVID. And I haven't heard any politician talking about this issue. And yeah, so it's very important to me.
Yeah, look, I will say, and you didn't ask...
Did you hear all that, or did I drop out?
No, I did. I heard all of that, and you actually didn't ask what I thought you were going to ask, and I will address it directly because you may not be aware of it. I believe Senator Lionhelm, who was former senator of the then LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party.
Yeah, no,
I believe
totally.
So I believe he actually supported that policy, and I think he was incredibly wrong to do so. And my policy and the party's policy would be to repeal those laws. I think that where subsidies do exist, they should exist without discrimination, and certainly without medical discrimination. So that's my answer. I know that when our party had the opportunity to make positive change or to take a stand on that, they failed that test. And I probably know far less about the state of play in all jurisdictions on vaccination laws than you do. I'd love to engage with you and to hear from you on that topic. If you have time, please feel free to send me a DM. But I just want to make clear that the position Senator Leyonhjelm took on that topic at the time was, I think, not fully informed. I think it was the wrong policy based on libertarian principles, and it's not a policy I would support.
Thank you, Tyrannical. Now I'm going to go to another question in the comments section. A666 asks on Twitter, on the immigration fee, how do you handle spouses and children? If a company wants to hire a married man or woman, instead of 100K, would they have to pay 200K, essentially making immigration to Australia only being available to singles?
So I don't think that's necessarily what would happen. So I know I can speak to my own family's migration experience from Germany. I know my grandfather came over first by boat at that time, and then a couple of years later, when he was in a position to support my grandmother to come over, because the physical cost of coming to Australia was, for that time, if you worked it out in today's dollars inflation-wise, he probably paid not that different a cost to bring my grandmother out by cruise ship from Germany to Australia at the time. And he only did that when he was in a position to financially afford to do it. And I think that having a husband, in this instance, come out to Australia, establish a beachhead and a life, and then be in a position to bring their family. I certainly don't think kids should be paying the fee. I think children should be exempt from that migration fee if they're joining an adult spouse who is paying it. But again, I think that there would be a market for companies who wanted to attract working families to pay for the migration fee of the spouse of their employee. I think that there would be a significant, I think that the incentives as they would play out, I don't agree that what you fear would happen would happen. I think that if anything, a dynamic of a spouse, we're saying husband, but it could be, whoever, I don't care the point. But, I think we would see a dynamic emerge where you would have one member of a couple come out and establish a beachhead, and then they would bring their family with them once they were established. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you'll note in our policy, we exclude the spousal visas in the sense of an Australian citizen marrying a partner from overseas, whatever, that's a different story. But if two people who are a family want to migrate, they would both have to pay the fee. I think that the dynamic that would create would be someone going ahead and establishing a sort of a home and a space for that partner and their family, and then bringing them over once they were established. And I actually think that's very healthy and not something we should be too worried about.
Thank you, Jordan. Now I want to say hello to Owen Miller. Owen, did you have a question for Jordan on the libertarian policies?
I just want to quickly answer a question just in the YouTube chat.
Yeah,
so Gavin Barr on the YouTube chat has joined, I think, quite late and didn't catch some of our immigration stuff. Gavin, we would be setting the fee, so the price for migration would be set by auction based off a desired initial intake of between 60,000 and 100,000 per year. Would be the approximate intake that I think I would favour as the candidate applying that policy. And then that would be reviewed by the Productivity Commission within 5 years. And we estimated back in 2016, when we provided a submission to the migrant intake inquiry that we referred to the Productivity Commission, we estimated in 2016 that the rough migration fee then would have been, we have estimated based on auction around about $40,000. With inflation, taking that into account in 2025, we figure it would be around about $100,000 would be the expected. That's what we would estimate the auction set migration fee would roughly be. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, and I'll introduce Owen Miller again. Owen, did you have a question for Jordan about the libertarian policies in general?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for putting this on. I think it's commendable that you're making yourself accessible to everyone. Yeah. But yeah, my question is, I understand you're keeping government Medicare, yeah, and so I wonder, what are your thoughts about classifying aging as a disease? I see it as like, if someone wants to live forever, shouldn't they be free to do so? Shouldn't they be able to get the treatment they need to, to extend their life? What are your views on biohacking in general?
Yeah, wow, that's a really niche question I wasn't expecting tonight. I actually think my take on this is probably informed a little bit by my experiences. My wife is an aged care nurse, and I think the idea that even if it were medically possible that everyone would want to live forever is pretty questionable. I think that, realistically, what I would love to see when it comes to aging is I would love to see a system similar to what they have in Italy and similar to what they have in parts of Europe, where there are no aged care facilities. Extended families are, generally culturally, they will live together. That the grandparents will live on the same property or in the same house as the kids and the grandkids. They'll often live longer, healthier lives because they've got that sense of purpose and engagement with their family. And I think that I don't think aging should be treated as a disease. I think that aging will probably be rendered a very different phenomenon by medical advances. But I actually think that we need to start taking more responsibility for aging as individuals. And so another thing in my background, and if anyone listens to the campaign and sort of gets to know me, whatever, I'll keep saying things I've done and they'll be like, how many lives can you have? But I'm a qualified personal trainer as well. And I've seen the impact that taking responsibility for your own health and for your own independence can have on quality of life and on the cost you have in later life. And I think that we should be encouraging individuals to take responsibility for their own aging. I don't think we should be socializing the cost of aging, because aging can cost very different things depending on how you take care of yourself. And I think that we should be encouraging families to really take a more active role in caring for the elderly and in building extended family units. And I think that would actually have a lot of other flow and benefits for society as well. If I think about what I would love to do with my parents, I would love to be in a position to support my parents to live where they want to live independently for as long as they can. And I'd love to be in a position for them to play a role in helping raise my kids and really having that kind of extended family little village. My brother-in-law lives with Georgie, my wife, and I as well. He's had mental health challenges, and I'm really, really proud that we've been able to support him and sort of he got off Centrelink a couple of years ago and he's never looked back. I've never seen him happier. I know this is kind of ranging a long way from your original question, but I just think the way we think about caring for our extended family and planning and taking responsibility for aging, I think that really would be great to see change.
Thank you, Owen Miller. Now, let me say hello to Martin Brown. Martin, did you have a question for Jordan on the libertarian policies?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, there's a lot to like in these policies. I would sort of agree with you on the foreign policy that I think Australia should be the Switzerland of the South Sea. But I disagree on your statements about the nuclear subs. I think they are actually kind of important for our naval strategy, where we have a snake in the brambles, so to speak, up in the north of Australia, and the rest around Australia is, you can see an enemy coming. So that's my point on that. But my question is, I happen to notice that there wasn't a policy on firearms, and I can appreciate that it wouldn't be a sort of important thing for this election, but I think with the way current regulations are, there's a lot of policies that don't make sense. For example, appearance laws, like banning a firearm based on how it looks it just doesn't make sense to me. And other things like airsoft guns, which technically should be like classified the same way as paintball or gel blasters. I was just wanting to get to know a bigger picture of this. And another thing is with feral pest control, I think there's certain cases where you are restricted in, like OHS, where you can't have a silencer, so it damages your hearing, or if there's multiple rabbits or whatever, a bolt action rifle might not be sufficient for the task. So what I wanted to know was, what is our policy on firearms as a side thing?
I totally understand. Look, that's a great question. And, from a federal standpoint, we oppose the National Firearms Agreement, and we absolutely oppose the creation of a National Firearms Register. Those are the federal dimensions. A lot of the firearms policy you're curious about takes place at a state level. And at the moment, we've got a state election being run in WA, where I'm going to send you a link by DM after this to our fantastic WA state firearms policy, which gives you a really good idea of libertarian principles applied by this party towards firearms at a state level. So, when I was talking earlier about education being an area that the federal government's interfered with, firearms rights are another really great example of where the federal government should have no business sticking its nose. And to the extent that firearms issues as a federal candidate really revolve around pushing firearms issues back down to the states and not imposing a top-down draconian federal position. But I'm more than happy to send you a link to our WA state firearms policy, which I think will go to a lot of the questions, and they're really at the forefront. So.
Thank you very much, Martin. And of course, thank you, Jordan, for answering questions. If you're listening on YouTube or Facebook right now, you can leave questions in the comments as well. But also, if you are on X as well, join Jordan on his weekly Twitter Spaces, where, of course, you can come up and join the conversation as well. Jordan, before we start to wind down the space, are there any final comments on YouTube or Facebook that you'd like to speak on?
Look, no comments, but thank you everyone for your time tonight. Thank you for your patience as we've gotten this document out. I'm really proud of it. I'm going to keep obviously talking about it and selling it in between now and the federal election. Again, if there are points in there that you disagree with or you don't think go far enough, I think it would be a mistake to simply throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that the Libertarian Party is a party that is accessible, that is able to be engaged with, and you can join the party, and you can have a lot of influence over the direction of the party going forward. And the fundamentals of the policy we're putting forward are really sound, providing genuine solutions to these problems, and will be a real way forward. So I did notice that separately to this space on X, there have been a couple of questions from people I can see in the space. So Lozzie B, for example, you want a bit more info on the migration policy. We did go into that earlier in the space, but I think you might have missed it. And I'm more than happy after this to address your questions and provide a bit more detail on how our policies would be applied. I'm looking forward to engaging with you guys over the coming weeks and months. And today, being Australia Day and traveling all around the country to attend multiple events, really gave me a great sense of optimism about the upcoming federal campaign and where we're heading. I'm really excited and very close to stepping up to full-time campaigning. And look, if you're in this space and you're just here to listen and you still disagree with me, that's fine. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, and I'm more than happy to have the debate and agree to disagree as well. So thanks, everyone. And thank you again, Preston. And yeah, I'll look forward to seeing you guys in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone who came and listened tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. And of course, join Jordan on his space, usually on Friday. So next Friday, make sure you follow Jordan. Follow this Libertarian account that I'm speaking on now. There is also the Victorian Libertarian account in the listeners to make sure you follow that one as well. Thank you, Jordan, and good night, everyone.
And good night, YouTube and Facebook. I'm turning off the
Night,
stream
guys.
now. Good night, everyone. Good night, Jordan.